A 12-year-old boy sits alone in a cramped apartment on the edge of Konoha, moonlight spilling through a cracked window, illuminating stacks of paper that shouldn't exist in the room of the villager's least favorite prankster. Sealed diagrams? Chakra flow equations. Notes in a handwriting too precise, too controlled, too adult for the boy everyone calls the class clown. If you think you know this story, think again. Because what if Naruto Uzumaki, the boy who supposedly failed the graduation exam 3 times, the boy who couldn't perform a simple Bunshin no Jutsu to save his life, was hiding something far greater than a fox behind his whiskered cheeks? What if, behind that idiot grin, lived a mind sharper than any in the elemental nations? Stick around, because this is the story of how Naruto Uzumaki's intelligence didn't just change his life. It rewrote the fate of an entire lost village. And if you're new here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because this series only gets more interesting from here. Let's begin. The night it happened, Naruto was 8 years old. It wasn't a dramatic battle. It wasn't a clash of legendary shinobi or some ancient prophecy unfolding under a blood moon. It was almost embarrassingly mundane, the kind of moment historians would never think to write about, if anyone in the village had cared enough to watch him in the first place. He had been running. That part, at least, was normal. Running from a group of Chūnin-level villagers who'd had one too many quiet words about the fox brat wandering too close to the memorial stone. Naruto had ducked into an alley behind an old, abandoned shrine, one of the many half-forgotten structures Konoha never bothered to tear down because nobody wanted to spend the money. He tripped. Hit his head on a stone tablet buried beneath decades of dirt and neglect. And in that half-second of dizziness, something inside the seal on his stomach hiccuped. That's really the only word for it. A hiccup. A flicker. A brief and almost accidental cross-current between the enormous, ancient chakra sealed within him and the developing neural pathways of an 8-year-old's brain. Kurama, sealed, furious, restrained, felt it too. The fox's chakra brushed against something in that tablet, some old fragment of Uzumaki's sealing knowledge embedded in the stone, and for the length of a single breath, information flowed. Not memories. Not power. Just architecture. The scaffolding upon which a mind could build itself. Naruto didn't understand any of this, of course. Not that night. All he knew was that his headache faded, the world came back into focus, and when he looked at the cracked, moss-covered symbols on that buried tablet, he could suddenly read them, not just read them. Understand them. The way you or I might glance at a simple arithmetic problem and instantly know the answer without needing to calculate it step by step. He sat there in that alley for nearly 3 hours, tracing the faded lines of an incomplete sealing formula with his finger, and by the time he stood up to go home, something fundamental in him had changed. He didn't tell anyone. Who would he tell? The old man at the ramen stand? The Hokage, who barely had time for him between village council meetings? No, Naruto kept it to himself, the way he'd learned to keep everything to himself. But that night marked the beginning of something the village would spend years failing to notice. For years later, the boy sitting in that cramped apartment was not the same boy who tripped in an alley. His analytical mind, the villagers would have called it monstrous, had they known, the same way they called the fox inside him monstrous, had spent 4 years quietly devouring everything it could reach. Academy textbooks, sure, but also anything else Naruto could get his hands on. Old scrolls left in unlocked archive rooms. Discarded notes from Jonin-sensei who assumed nobody would bother digging through the trash behind the mission assignment office. Overheard conversations between shop owners, farmers, merchants, each one a data point in the boy's endlessly expanding understanding of how the world actually worked, as opposed to how the village pretended it worked. By the time he was 12, Naruto's mind operated less like a person thinking through a problem and more like a river carving through stone, patient, relentless, and always finding the path of least resistance to the truth. He'd calculated, quite early on, that revealing this to anyone would be a catastrophic mistake. Consider the political reality he lived in. A village that already feared and resented him for the tenet sealed in his gut. A council with elders who'd sooner see him controlled, or eliminated, than empowered. A shadowy old war hawk named Danzō whose root organization specialized in finding exactly the kind of useful tool a genius Jinchuriki would make, and exactly the kind of methods that would strip away everything that made that tool a person. No. If Naruto Uzumaki wanted to survive long enough to matter, he needed a mask. And the mask he chose, loud, foolish, hyperactive, desperate for attention, was, frankly, a masterpiece of misdirection. Think about it for a moment. What better way to hide unprecedented intelligence than behind a personality so obnoxious that everyone stops paying attention to what you're actually doing? The villagers saw a nuisance and looked away. The academy instructors saw a lost cause and stopped watching. Even his own classmates saw a punchline and never thought to ask what he did with all those hours alone. It was, in Naruto's own private assessment, the single most effective strategy available to him. And so he committed to it fully, failing tests he could have aced in his sleep, accidentally botching a Bunshin no Jutsu with the same precision most people would use to nail it perfectly, laughing too loud and talking too much and making absolutely sure that nobody looked twice. But behind that mask, in the quiet hours after the sun went down and the village finally stopped watching, Naruto worked. That particular night, the one where our story truly begins, Naruto sat cross-legged on his apartment floor, a small kerosene lamp casting warm light across a spread of papers that would have made any archivist in the Hokage's tower faint. At the center of it all, a leather journal, its cover worn soft with age, its pages yellowed and fragile. He'd found it 3 weeks earlier. Tucked inside a false bottom of an old storage chest the third Hokage had quietly passed along to him, a chest supposedly containing personal effects from his parents that the Hokage claimed had been recovered from a Konoha safehouse. Naruto suspected that wasn't the whole truth. He suspected a lot of things weren't the whole truth, but he'd learned, over 4 years of quiet observation, that suspecting was useless without evidence, and evidence was exactly what this journal provided. Because this journal had belonged to his mother, Kushina Uzumaki. He traced her handwriting with something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite hope, some third emotion that didn't have a proper name, reserved only for children piecing together the parents they never got to know. Most of the journal was mundane, diary entries about missions, complaints about her sensei, doodles in the margins of what Naruto assumed were friends from her genin days, but scattered throughout, hidden in code that took Naruto exactly 40 minutes to crack, because his mother, brilliant as she'd been, had used a substitution cipher based on the old Uzumaki naming conventions, and Naruto's mind simply saw patterns other people had to search for, were references to something else entirely. Uzushiogakure, the village hidden in the whirling tides. The homeland of the Uzumaki clan. Destroyed decades ago in a coordinated attack by 3 allied villages who feared the Uzumaki mastery of Fuinjutsu too much to let it exist unchecked. Naruto had learned about Uzushiogakure the way most academy students learned about it, a footnote, a single paragraph in a dusty history text, mentioned mostly to explain the spiral symbol on Konoha's flak jackets. Destroyed. Abandoned. Forgotten. But his mother's journal told a different story. The vault survived. One coded passage read, once Naruto had finished decrypting it. Whatever they did to the surface, they never found what's beneath. Grandmother always said the true wealth of Uzushio was never the buildings. It was what we buried before the end. Naruto had read that line perhaps 30 times that first night he decoded it. Vaults. Sealing knowledge. An entire clan's worth of Fuinjutsu mastery, buried and waiting, untouched for over a decade. Tonight, he was 3 passages further into the journal, and what he found made something in his analytical mind, a mind that rarely, if ever, felt surprise, genuinely light up. If anything happens to us, the passage read, in his mother's looping, hurried script, and you find this, know that the old barrier seals still hold. Look for the spiral within the spiral. The key isn't a place. It's a bloodline. It's you. Naruto sat back, staring at the lamp flame, turning the sentence over in his mind from every conceivable angle. The key isn't a place. It's a bloodline. It's you. His mother had known. Somehow, she had known that whatever protections remained around Uzushiogakures hidden vaults were keyed to Uzumaki blood, perhaps to a specific chakra signature, perhaps to something more esoteric involving the clan's unique life force reserves. Either way, the implication was staggering. Whatever remained buried in the ruins of Uzushiogakure could only be accessed by an Uzumaki. And as far as Naruto's admittedly exhaustive research had been able to determine, There was exactly one Uzumaki left standing in the entire elemental nations who wasn't hiding in some remote corner of the world under an assumed name. Him. Let's pause here for a second, because I know some of you watching are wondering, why does any of this matter? Why would a 12-year-old academy student, even a secretly brilliant one, care about some ruined village from a war that ended before he was born? Here's the thing about Naruto's mind that made him different from every strategist Konoha had ever produced. He didn't just process information. He processed implications. He didn't see a destroyed village. He saw an opportunity that every other shinobi in the world had overlooked simply because they'd stopped looking. Consider what Konoha actually was to Naruto at 12 years old. A village that had sealed a monster inside him without his consent, then blamed him for existing. A village that fed him lies about his own heritage while simultaneously expecting his unconditional loyalty. A village where he was, by his own careful calculations, approximately one bad council meeting away from being reassigned to Danzō's care the moment anyone discovered what he could actually do. Uzushiogakure, on the other hand, represented something Konoha never had and never would give him, a place that was his. Not by charity. Not by pity. By blood, by right, by the simple fact that he was the last son of a fallen nation with nobody left to challenge his claim to it. And Naruto's mind ran through this hypothesis with the rigor of a full military campaign. If he could rebuild even a fraction of what Uzushiogakure once was, he would have something no Jinchuriki in history had ever possessed: leverage. A homeland. A power base entirely separate from the village that saw him as a weapon to be contained. And more than that, though Naruto would never have admitted this part out loud, even to himself, because his analytical mind had a habit of suppressing anything it classified as sentiment, he would have a family. A people. A place where the name Uzumaki meant something other than monster's cage. He closed the journal gently, running his thumb along its worn spine, and made a decision that would set the next several years of his life, and the next several chapters of this story, into motion. He was going to find Uzushiogakure. And he was going to bring it back. The next morning, Naruto arrived at the academy exactly 7 minutes late, tripping dramatically over the doorway in a display so convincing that Iruka-sensei didn't even bother looking up from his roll call sheet before sighing and marking him tardy. Sorry. Naruto called out, scrambling to his usual seat with all the grace of a startled duck. I overslept, believe it. Sakura, sitting 2 rows up, rolled her eyes without turning around. Shikamaru, slouched against the window with his chin on his folded arms, cracked one eye open just long enough to register Naruto's arrival before closing it again, muttering something about troublesome mornings. If you had told either of them that the boy currently apologizing for tripping over a doorway had, the night before, cracked a decades-old substitution cipher and was quietly plotting the resurrection of an entire hidden village, they'd have laughed you out of the room. That was, of course, exactly the point. Iruka droned on about the upcoming written examination on basic chakra theory, material Naruto had mastered years ago, material he could have taught the class himself with considerably more nuance than his instructor, and Naruto let his eyes glaze over in a performance of boredom so convincing it bordered on artistry. But beneath the desk, his fingers moved. He'd taken to carrying a small notebook disguised as a doodle pad, filled with what looked, to any casual observer, like a child's aimless scribbles. Spirals. Stick figures. The occasional crude drawing of a ramen bowl. But if you looked closely, if you had, say, a mind capable of parsing 500 data points a second, you would notice that the spirals weren't random at all. They were fragments of seal formulas, broken apart and hidden inside doodles, notes he was making to himself about barrier theory, ley line convergence, and the tidal patterns of a coastline he had never once visited. Iruka called on him twice during the lecture, expecting, as always, a wrong answer that would justify a gentle correction and a reminder to pay attention. Naruto, what's the fundamental principle behind the transformation jutsu? Naruto blinked, scratched the back of his head, and delivered an answer just wrong enough to be believable, just close enough to the truth that Iruka wouldn't suspect anything deeper than a lucky guess. You gotta think really hard about the thing you want to turn into? And then your chakra does the rest? Close, Iruka said, chalk scraping against the board as he wrote the actual formula. It's about reshaping the visual and chakra signature simultaneously, not just visualization. Pay attention, Naruto. Right. Got it. Naruto grinned, giving a thumbs up. He had, in fact, gotten it 4 years ago. He'd gotten it well enough to theorize 3 separate improvements to the standard transformation technique, none of which he had any intention of demonstrating in a room full of people who'd immediately start asking uncomfortable questions. This, the deliberate, calculated performance of mediocrity, was, Naruto had come to realize, exhausting in its own strange way. Not physically. Mentally, it required constant vigilance, constant recalibration, a never-ending internal monitoring system running in the background of every conversation, every test, every sparring match. How much can I show without showing too much? What's the acceptable margin of error that keeps me invisible? It was, in its own way, the most difficult technique he'd ever had to master. Harder than any seal. Harder than any jutsu. The art of being underestimated by design. Lunch break came, and Naruto did what he always did, grabbed his tray, found the corner of the courtyard nobody else wanted, and pulled out his notebook again while pretending to eat. Today, though, someone interrupted his solitude. "You've been weird lately," said a voice, and Naruto looked up to find Sakura Haruno standing over him, arms crossed, her expression somewhere between curiosity and suspicion. Naruto blinked, running a rapid internal assessment. Sakura wasn't someone he flagged as a significant observational risk. Her attention, historically, had been almost entirely consumed by Sasuke Uchiha, leaving little bandwidth for noticing anything about Naruto beyond his general obnoxiousness. Her approaching him now, unprompted, with an actual observation, was a deviation from established pattern. "Weird how?" Naruto asked, keeping his tone light, curious, slightly wounded, the exact emotional register a normal 12-year-old would use in response to an unexpected accusation. "I don't know. Quieter, I guess." Sakura tilted her head, studying him the way she might study an unfamiliar plant species, trying to decide if it was dangerous. "You've been sneaking off after class instead of bothering everyone for ramen money." Interesting, Naruto thought. She's tracking my behavioral baseline more closely than I accounted for. He filed the observation away. Sakura Haruno, higher situational awareness than previously estimated, worth monitoring. Out loud, he simply shrugged, scratching his cheek. "Guess I'm just tired of getting yelled at for eating too much ramen. Trying to save some money, believe it." It wasn't remotely convincing. Even Naruto knew that, his self-assessment running the probability of Sakura fully accepting the explanation at somewhere around 30%. But it didn't need to be fully convincing. It just needed to be plausible enough that pursuing the question further would feel more effortful than it was worth. Sakura studied him another moment, then rolled her eyes and walked off towards Sasuke, who was, predictably, ignoring everyone in stoic silence at the far end of the courtyard. Naruto exhaled slowly once she was out of earshot, and made a small mental note: tighten the performance. Reduce visible deviation from baseline behavior. Accelerate research timeline before more people start asking questions. He glanced down at his notebook, at the coordinates he'd been slowly triangulating over the past several nights. Old maps cross-referenced with tidal charts, historical trade route documents, and fragments from his mother's journal, all converging on a stretch of coastline in the land of whirlpools that, according to every official record, contained nothing but ruins and seawater. Official records, Naruto had learned, were rarely the whole story. That evening, after the academy let out and the last of his classmates had scattered toward homes with parents waiting inside them, Naruto slipped away from the main road and made his way to the Konoha Public Archive, a modest building tucked behind the main library, staffed by a single elderly clerk who'd long since stopped paying close attention to which academy students wandered in and out. He'd been here often enough over the past year that the clerk, a stooped, soft-spoken man named Ebisuji, no relation to the tutor of similar name, much to Naruto's private amusement, barely glanced up from his crossword puzzle when Naruto pushed through the door. "Evening, kid," Ebisuji mumbled. "Same section as always?" "Yes, sir," Naruto chirped, offering his best sunny grin before making his way toward the back corner of the archive, a dusty, poorly organized shelf of historical documents that most shinobi considered too outdated to bother with. Old trade agreements. Deprecated maps. Records from villages that no longer existed. It was, in Naruto's estimation, one of the most valuable rooms in the entire village, precisely because nobody else valued it at all. He pulled a familiar scroll from a low shelf, a partial map of the old land of Whirlpool's coastline, faded and water-damaged, salvaged decades ago by some forgotten Konoha survey team and never properly catalogued. He'd spent the last several weeks cross-referencing this map against his mother's journal, against tidal pattern records from the Land of Fire's naval archives, against half a dozen other fragments of information scattered across sources nobody else had thought to connect. Tonight, he laid the map flat across a reading table and produced a small piece of chalk, marking a series of points along the coastline, points where, according to his calculations, the old Uzumaki barrier's seals would have been anchored to the surrounding landscape. Spiral within the spiral, he thought, staring at the pattern forming beneath his chalk marks. Not a literal spiral. A recursive structure. Seals nested within seals, each one key to reinforce the next. His mind raced through the implications, mapping Fuinjutsu theory he taught himself from stolen scraps of advanced scrolls, cross-referencing chakra flow diagrams with the tidal geography of the region. If the old Uzumaki elders had built their vaults using a recursive barrier structure, then the key his mother mentioned wouldn't be a physical object at all. It would be a resonance. A specific chakra frequency, key to Uzumaki bloodline signatures, that would need to be projected in a specific sequence to unlock each successive layer of the barrier. And if that was true, then finding the vaults wasn't really the challenge at all. Surviving what's guarding them, that was the real question. Naruto sat back, chalk dust on his fingers, mind whirring through contingency after contingency. Decades-old seals could degrade in unpredictable ways. Guardian constructs. If the old Uzumaki had been paranoid enough to install any, and knowing the clan's reputation for meticulous defensive design, Naruto considered this a near certainty, could have developed faults, misfires, unintended lethal responses to imperfect approaches. He would need to be careful. Methodical. He would need, frankly, to plan this infiltration with the same rigor a Kage might apply to a full military campaign, except with no support, no backup, and absolutely no one he could tell if something went wrong. Perfect, he thought, with the faintest, humorless smile. Just how I like it. It was nearly midnight by the time Naruto made his way home, the streets of Konoha quiet and washed in pale moonlight. The smell of the evening's last cooking fires still lingering faintly in the air from the food stalls near the market district. He passed the darkened window of a small tea house, its counter wiped down for the night, a stack of clean cups drying beside a kettle, the closest thing to nightlife this part of the village offered, and precisely the kind of quiet, modest establishment Naruto found himself craving, small comforts amid the vast, lonely calculations occupying his mind. He let himself into his apartment, locked the door out of habit rather than any real expectation of privacy, a habit he'd developed after discovering, at age 10, that at least one root operative had searched his apartment while he was out on a supervised training exercise, and settled back down at his desk, pulling his mother's journal from its hiding spot beneath a loose floorboard. There was one passage he hadn't fully decoded yet. He'd left it for last, almost superstitiously, the way you might save the last bite of a meal you didn't want to end. Tonight, he decided, was the night. It took him nearly 2 hours, longer than any other passage in the journal. The cipher layered with an additional substitution key that Naruto suspected his mother had designed specifically to prevent anyone without deep Uzumaki cultural knowledge from cracking it. But eventually, letter by letter, the message revealed itself. To whoever finds this, my son, if the world has been kind, though I doubt it has, the vault beneath the old shrine holds more than sealing scrolls. It holds the last written record of who we were before the war. Names. Faces. Techniques passed down through 11 generations. If you're reading this, it means the clan as we knew it is gone, and you are what's left. Don't let it stay that way. Uzushiogakure doesn't need to be what it was. It needs to be what you decide it should be. Whatever you have to sacrifice, whatever mask you have to wear to protect what you're building, do it. I would have. Your father would have too, though he'd have found some annoyingly noble way to make it look effortless. You are the last spiral. Make it turn again. Naruto sat perfectly still for a long moment after finishing the translation, the lamp flame flickering low, casting long shadows across the walls of a room that had, for 12 years, felt like the loneliest place in the world. You are the last spiral. Make it turn again. He closed the journal, pressed it against his chest for exactly 3 seconds, a small, uncharacteristic indulgence for a mind that generally treated sentiment as a variable to be minimized, and then set it aside, pulling out a fresh sheet of paper. If he was going to do this, truly do this, not just research it in secret but actually build something from the ruins of a village 3 villages had conspired to erase, he needed a plan, not a vague ambition. A structured, phased, executable plan, the kind any competent strategist would draft before committing resources to a campaign. Phase 1. Confirm the location and assess the vault's structural integrity. Phase 2. Establish a cover story for extended absence from the village that won't raise suspicion. Phase 3. Begin physical reconnaissance of the ruins. Phase 4. And here Naruto paused, chewing the end of his pencil, allowing himself, for just a moment, something that felt almost like excitement. Phase 4. Rebuild. He worked until nearly 3 in the morning, filling page after page with contingencies, resource estimates, timeline projections synced against the academy calendar, and the looming shadow of the Chūnin Exams he knew was still months away but which he was already, characteristically, planning 6 steps ahead of. By the time exhaustion finally caught up with him, and he collapsed onto his thin mattress, the first gray light of dawn was beginning to creep over the rooftops of Konoha. He had, by his own calculations, approximately 11 months before the Chūnin Exams would place him under significantly more scrutiny, village elders, foreign shinobi, potential threats all converging on Konoha at once. 11 months to make progress on something that, by any reasonable estimate, should have taken years. It wasn't much time. But then again, Naruto Uzumaki had never been particularly interested in what reasonable estimates said was possible. 3 days later, Naruto stood at the edge of a cliff overlooking a stretch of coastline that no official Konoha map had bothered to update in over a decade, salt wind tugging at his orange jacket, the roar of waves crashing against jagged rocks below drowning out every other sound in the world. He told Irika-sensei he was staying with a distant relative for a short trip, a lie so mundane, so utterly unremarkable, that nobody had thought to question it. A 12-year-old orphan visiting family for a few days raised exactly 0 flags in a village that had spent his entire life actively trying not to think about him. Below him, half submerged in shallow water and centuries of accumulated silt, lay the ruins of Uzushiogakure, broken towers jutting from the water like the bones of some vast, forgotten creature, spiral crests still faintly visible on crumbling stonework that the sea had spent decades trying, and failing, to erase completely. Naruto felt something in his chest tighten, not quite grief, not quite awe, but some third thing entirely, a feeling his exhaustively analytical mind found itself, for once, unable to fully categorize. This is it, he thought. This is where it starts. He took a slow breath, closed his eyes, and let his chakra extend outward in a careful, controlled pulse, a technique of his own design, meant to map the underlying chakra architecture of a location without triggering any dormant defensive seals. The results came back almost instantly, and what he found made his eyes snap open in genuine, unfiltered surprise. Beneath the ruins, beneath the broken towers and the drowned streets, and the decades of silence, something was still active. A faint, steady pulse of chakra buried deep beneath the seafloor, old but unmistakably alive, pulsing in a rhythm that matched, with eerie precision, the spiral patterns tattooed across every piece of Uzumaki architecture he'd ever studied. The vault. It was real. It was intact. And it was waiting. Waiting, Naruto suspected, his mind already racing through the implications, already calculating the risks, already drafting the next dozen contingencies he'd need to survive whatever lay beneath those waves. For exactly one thing. An Uzumaki heartbeat to come home. Naruto returned to Konoha 4 days after his coastal excursion, sunbrowned and windburned in a way that could easily be explained away as visiting relatives near the coast. His cover story so mundane that not a single person, not Irika, not the Hokage's assistant who processed his brief absence paperwork, not even the 2 root operatives Danzō kept assigned to loosely monitor the Jinchuriki's movements, thought to question it further. That, of course, was exactly the point. Naruto had learned, over 4 years of careful study, that the most effective lies were the ones too boring to investigate. He arrived at the academy the morning team placements were set to be announced, and if he'd been sitting in that classroom, you would have seen exactly what everyone else saw, a slightly too loud 12-year-old bouncing in his seat, alternating between nervous energy and overconfident boasting. Absolutely nothing like a boy who'd spent the last several nights mapping recursive barrier seals beneath the ocean floor. Bet I get put with Sakura-chan, Naruto announced to nobody in particular, grinning so widely his eyes nearly closed. Behind that grin, however, a very different process was underway. Naruto's mind, always running multiple calculations in parallel, always cross-referencing new information against existing models, had already worked out, with reasonably high confidence, exactly how Irika and the other instructors would structure the genin teams. Balance was the operative principle in every iteration of team placement Konoha had used for the past several decades. One strong offensive specialist, one strategic or support-oriented member, one anchor with above-average scores across multiple categories to stabilize the group. Given his own carefully maintained academic record, abysmal on paper, despite what lay beneath it, and Sasuke Uchiha's position at the top of the class, Naruto had calculated a 78% probability that the two of them would be placed together, if only to balance out Sasuke's individual excellence with Naruto's supposed deficiencies. Sakura Haruno's placement alongside them followed logically from her romantic fixation on Sasuke combined with her above-average written test scores. Precisely the kind of soft strategic pairing Irika favored when structuring teams meant to function cohesively rather than merely competently. So when Irika stood at the front of the room and announced, Team 7, Naruto Uzumaki, Sakura Haruno, Sasuke Uchiha, Naruto's outward reaction, a triumphant fist pump, an exaggerated groan from Sakura, a flat, disinterested grunt from Sasuke, masked an internal reaction that was considerably more subdued, confirmed, he thought, already moving on to the next variable in his ongoing assessment. Now which jonin? There were, by his estimation, only a handful of jonin currently available and suited to lead a new genin team, and of those, exactly one carried a reputation significant enough to concern him, Kakashi Hatake, copy ninja, son of the White Fang. A shinobi whose observational skills were, by every account Naruto had gathered, dramatically superior to any of the other candidates. If Team 7 was assigned Kakashi-sensei, Naruto would need to recalibrate. Significantly, your Jonin-sensei will introduce themselves after lunch, Irika announced, and Naruto filed the delay away as one more data point, one more variable to plan around, one more small piece of a puzzle he'd been assembling for years now with a patience most adults would find genuinely unsettling in a child. Lunch came and went, Naruto performing his usual routine of loudly complaining about Sasuke's popularity, while secretly observing every micro-expression Sakura made whenever Sasuke's name came up, cataloging data he had no immediate use for but collected anyway, out of habit as much as anything, and by the time the three genin reconvened in the empty classroom that afternoon, exactly one member of their new team had not yet appeared. Where is he? Sakura huffed, arms crossed, glancing at the door for what had to be the 15th time in as many minutes. Everyone else's sensei showed up right away. Naruto, seated backward on his chair with his chin resting on his folded arms, offered a lazy shrug. Maybe he got lost on the road of life, he said, the joke landing with all the innocent absurdity of a 12-year-old's attempt at humor. He didn't mention that he'd already narrowed the field of likely candidates down to 3 names, cross-referencing mission board postings, recent hospital discharge records. A genuinely disturbing number of jonin seemed to cycle through minor injuries requiring exactly 1 week of leave, and the sparse public information available about which senior shinobi had recently completed their prior team assignments. He didn't mention that Kakashi Hatake sat at the top of that list, or that everything about the man's documented history suggested a shinobi who treated punctuality as, at best, a philosophical suggestion rather than an obligation. So when the classroom door finally slid open nearly 3 hours after the scheduled time, revealing a tall, silver-haired jonin with a mask covering the lower half of his face and a single dark eye regarding the 3 of them with an expression of profound, practiced boredom, Naruto's internal reaction was less surprise and more confirmation of hypothesis. My first impression of this group, Kakashi said, voice dry as old parchment, is that I hate you. Sakura's jaw dropped. Sasuke's eyes narrowed. Naruto, for his part, laughed, loudly, obnoxiously. The sound of a boy who genuinely found this insult hilarious rather than the sound of a strategist quietly re-evaluating everything he thought he knew about how this particular Jonin operated. Interesting, Naruto thought, watching Kakashi's single visible eye sweep across the three of them. Lingering, Naruto noted, with the faintest prickle of concern, perhaps a half-second longer on him than seemed strictly necessary. He's establishing dominance early. Testing our emotional reactions before any actual assessment begins. A deliberate provocation, not an unfiltered statement. Meet me on the roof, Kakashi said, and vanished in a swirl of leaves before any of them could respond. The introductions on the roof went more or less as Naruto had anticipated, though he'd allowed himself a small margin of uncertainty around exactly how Kakashi would frame the exercise. Sakura's introduction was fixated, predictably, on Sasuke. Sasuke's introduction was a masterclass in barely restrained trauma and revenge fixation that made even Naruto, who'd spent considerable time analyzing Sasuke's public behavior patterns, feel a flicker of genuine sympathy. And then it was his turn. "I'm Naruto Uzumaki," he announced, grinning wide enough to make his whiskered cheeks bunch up. "I like ramen, especially the kind from Ichiraku. I dislike the 3 minutes you have to wait for the water to boil before you can eat it. My hobby is pulling pranks, and my dream is to become Hokage so everyone in the village has to acknowledge me. Believe it." It was, in every particular, exactly the introduction the village expected from him. Loud. Simple. A little pathetic, if you were inclined to be uncharitable about a boy's stated life goal. And every single word of it was, in its own carefully calculated way, a lie of omission rather than outright fabrication. Naruto did like ramen, did enjoy pranks, did dream of being acknowledged by the village that had spent his entire life pretending he didn't exist. He simply left out the considerably more complicated layers underneath. The mother's journal hidden beneath his floorboards, the ruins of a nation waiting to be reclaimed, the vault pulsing with old chakra beneath the waves of a coastline 3 villages had once conspired to erase. Kakashi's visible eye lingered on him again, longer, this time, than Naruto's threshold for acceptable scrutiny allowed for. Just a fraction of a second too long. A fraction of a second that, to anyone else in the world, would have meant nothing at all. To Naruto, it meant everything. He's not buying it. Not fully, Naruto assessed, keeping his outward expression carefully unchanged, still grinning, still bouncing slightly in place with childish energy. Recalibrate. Increase performance intensity. Reduce any further deviation from established baseline. All right, Kakashi said, looking between the three of them with the same flat, unreadable expression he'd worn since the classroom. Tomorrow, meet me at training ground 7, 5 a.m. Bring your gear. Don't eat breakfast, or you'll throw up. Wait, why? Sakura started, but Kakashi had already vanished, leaves scattering in his wake, leaving 3 genin alone on a rooftop with considerably more questions than answers. That night, Naruto sat at his desk with his mother's journal open beside a fresh sheet of paper, working through the implications of Kakashi's lingering gaze with the same methodical focus he'd applied to decoding her cipher weeks earlier, the bell test. He knew what it was, of course. He'd catalogued every scrap of information he could find about Kakashi Hataki's training methods over the past several months, including a conversation he'd overheard between 2 Chūnin at a supply shop discussing how the copy ninja had failed every genin team assigned to him except one, going back years. The exercise itself wasn't complicated in principle. 2 bells, 3 genin, a rule stating only 2 could pass. An obvious lesson about teamwork buried just beneath the surface for anyone perceptive enough to notice it. Naruto had noticed it approximately 4 seconds after Kakashi first explained the rules. A solution so immediately, obviously correct that a part of him wondered how anyone could possibly fail it. Cooperation. Obviously. The entire test was designed to punish genin who prioritized individual glory over collective success, and the solution required nothing more than recognizing that a team of 3 could easily overpower one exhausted jonin if they coordinated properly, then working out the mechanics of retrieving 2 bells for 3 people without anyone going hungry. The challenge wasn't solving the puzzle. The challenge was solving it without revealing how quickly he'd solved it. He spent nearly 2 hours that night sketching out a deliberately imperfect strategy, one that would guide Sasuke and Sakura toward the correct answer without making it obvious that Naruto himself had understood the lesson from the very beginning. He needed Sasuke, prideful and fiercely independent, to reach the conclusion through his own reasoning, or at least believe he had. He needed Sakura, anxious and eager to please, to feel like a meaningful contributor rather than a bystander. And he needed himself to appear, throughout the entire exercise, exactly as incompetent and impulsive as Kakashi already expected him to be. Phase 1, he wrote, in his cramped, deliberately messy handwriting. Even his handwriting was a performance, carefully maintained to look worse than it actually was. Attempt a direct, foolish assault. Fail visibly and dramatically. Establish baseline incompetence. Phase 2, allows Sasuke to observe Kakashi's combat patterns during my failed attempt, providing him data to work with. Phase 3, engineer a moment where Sasuke is forced to consider teamwork, ideally through a scenario that threatens Sakura, since his own value system prioritizes protecting teammates above personal glory. Phase 4, ensure the final bell retrieval looks like Sasuke's strategic insight, not mine. It was, Naruto reflected, an absurd amount of planning for what should have been a simple exercise. But then again, everything in his life required this kind of layered, obsessive planning now. Every test, every sparring match, every conversation with a teacher or teammate demanded the same exhausting calculus of how much can I reveal without revealing too much. He closed his notebook, glanced at the small clock on his nightstand, barely past 10, which meant he had a scant 7 hours before he needed to be at Training Ground 7, and allowed himself a brief, genuine sigh. Just a little longer, he told himself, thinking of the pulsing chakra beneath the waves, the mother he'd never known, the village waiting to be reborn. Just get through the exams, then you can stop performing so much. He didn't fully believe that, even as he thought it. But it was, at least, a useful fiction to fall asleep to. 5 a.m. at Training Ground 7 found 3 groggy, breakfast-deprived genin sitting on the grass while Kakashi calmly explained the rules of the bell test. An alarm clock set on a nearby stump ticking down toward noon. 2 bells, Kakashi said, holding up the small silver objects for emphasis. 3 genin. Only 2 of you pass. The one who doesn't get sent back to the academy. Sakura's face went pale. Sasuke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Naruto, playing his part with the enthusiasm of a boy who genuinely believed brute force was the answer to every problem, immediately charged. It went, by design, extremely poorly. Kakashi caught him by the back of his jacket within seconds, holding a kunai loosely to the back of his neck with an expression of theatrical disappointment. Not even a hand seal, he sighed. Didn't they teach you anything at the academy? Let go of me. Naruto snapped, thrashing with exactly the right amount of undignified panic, before Kakashi released him and he scrambled back toward the tree line, muttering under his breath about cheating Jonin. From his position hidden in the underbrush moments later, Naruto watched Kakashi engage briefly with Sasuke, a short, sharp exchange of taijutsu that ended with Sasuke pinned upside down in a tree by a well-placed substitution trap, and with Sakura, whose confrontation ended even faster, courtesy of a genjutsu that left her convinced, for several tense minutes, that Sasuke lay gravely injured nearby. Textbook, Naruto thought, watching the scene unfold from cover, cataloging every detail of Kakashi's technique with clinical precision even as his outward performance remained that of a sulking, impatient boy waiting for his moment to strike. He's establishing individual weaknesses before forcing us into a corner. He wants us desperate enough to consider cooperation, but not desperate enough to coordinate deliberately. He's testing whether we reach the conclusion organically. This presented Naruto with a genuinely delicate engineering problem. He needed Sasuke and Sakura to organically reach the conclusion that teamwork was the answer, without Naruto's own hand being visible in that process. Push too hard, too obviously, and Kakashi's considerable observational skills might notice the manipulation. Push too little, and Sasuke's pride might drive the team toward individual failure instead. So Naruto did something that, on the surface, looked like nothing more than another failed, foolish attempt, but which was, in reality, a carefully constructed piece of theater. He burst from the underbrush with an exaggerated battle cry, launching directly at Kakashi with all the tactical subtlety of a startled boar. Kakashi, unsurprised, sidestepped easily, and Naruto, in the process of his failed charge, deliberately stumbled directly into the clearing where Sasuke, having freed himself from the tree trap, was crouched in cover. "Oi team!" Naruto hissed, loud enough for the words to carry, quiet enough to sound like genuine irritation rather than performance. "You gonna keep hiding, or are we actually gonna do something about this guy?" Sasuke's dark eyes flicked toward him, then toward the training ground where Kakashi stood, casually reading an orange-covered book he'd produced from his equipment pouch with theatrical indifference. "There's no way to beat a Jonin one-on-one," Sasuke said, more to himself than to Naruto, his analytical mind, considerable in its own right, though nowhere near the scale of Naruto's, already working through the tactical reality of their situation. "But if all three of us—" He stopped himself, jaw tightening, pride visibly warring with logic. Naruto, watching this internal struggle with the patience of a man watching a pot slowly come to boil, offered exactly the right amount of reluctant, impatient prodding. "Look, I don't want to work with you either, but I want those bells more than I hate the idea, so—" "Fine," Sasuke bit out, cutting him off. "But we need Sakura. If Kakashi already used a genjutsu on her, she needs backup before she does something stupid." There it is, Naruto thought, feeling something almost like satisfaction, the quiet, private satisfaction of a strategist watching a carefully engineered variable land exactly where he'd calculated it would. Protective instinct outweighs pride. Exactly as predicted. What followed was, by any objective measure, a genuinely well-executed piece of small unit tactics for three brand new genin, Sasuke coordinating a distraction while Sakura, recovered from her genjutsu and furious about it, provided a surprisingly effective diversion using a basic transformation technique, and Naruto, in the confusion, accidentally tripping directly into Kakashi's path at exactly the moment the Jonin's attention was split between his other two students. Kakashi caught him again, of course. Naruto had never actually intended to succeed in that particular grab. His stumble calculated purely to force Kakashi's attention toward him just long enough for Sasuke to close the distance from the opposite direction. What Naruto hadn't fully accounted for, however, was the brief, sharp look Kakashi gave him in the half-second before Sasuke's kunai forced the Jonin to disengage. A look that lingered just slightly too long on Naruto's face, taking in something that had nothing to do with the physical scramble happening around them. It was the same look from the rooftop. The same fraction of a second too long. And this time, Naruto's finely tuned analytical mind flagged something else entirely. Kakashi wasn't looking at a clumsy genin who'd stumbled into a fight by accident. He was looking at the timing. Naruto's accidental stumble had occurred at precisely the moment necessary to maximize its tactical usefulness. Not a beat sooner, not a beat later. To an untrained observer, that would look like luck. To someone with Kakashi's documented reputation for reading subtle tells in combat, it might look like something considerably more deliberate. Damage control, Naruto thought immediately, his mind already 3 steps ahead of his own body. Overcorrect. Make the next mistake obvious and genuinely careless. So, in the scramble that followed, Sasuke pressing an advantage, Sakura providing cover, the alarm clock on the stump ticking steadily toward the noon deadline, Naruto made a very visible, very unnecessary mistake, lunging for a bell at a moment where the geometry of the fight made success essentially impossible, allowing Kakashi to effortlessly bat him aside with an expression of weary, familiar disappointment. "You really don't learn, do you?" Kakashi sighed, not unkindly, tucking his orange book back into his weapons pouch as the timer's alarm finally rang out across the training ground. Time was up. The results, when they came, were exactly what Naruto had engineered them to be, though he made absolutely certain his relief looked like simple, uncomplicated joy rather than the satisfaction of a plan executed to specification. "You three," Kakashi said, looking between them with an expression that had shifted, subtly, from bored disdain to something almost approving, "are the first team I've passed in years." Sakura blinked. "Wait, we didn't even get a bell each." "Naruto didn't get one at all." "That's exactly the point," Kakashi said, settling onto the training ground's central stump, his single visible eye sweeping across the 3 of them with unusual gravity. "This test was never about the bells. It was about whether you'd sacrifice a teammate to save yourself. 99% of genin who take this test fail to see that, because they're taught to think only about individual accomplishment. You 3 figured out, eventually, that a shinobi who abandons their comrades is worse than trash." He let that statement hang in the air for a long moment, and Naruto, watching Sasuke's expression shift almost imperceptibly, filed the moment away as data worth remembering. Kakashi's own value system centers explicitly around comradeship over individual glory. Likely rooted in personal history, worth further investigation, later carefully, without drawing attention to the inquiry. Team 7 starts missions tomorrow, Kakashi continued, standing and dusting off his flak jacket. Get some rest. You'll need it. As the other two turned to leave, Sakura already chattering excitedly about their first official mission, Sasuke offering nothing but a non-committal grunt, Kakashi's voice stopped Naruto before he could follow. Naruto. Stay a moment. Sakura and Sasuke exchanged a brief glance but continued on without comment, leaving Naruto alone with his new sensei in the empty training ground, the morning sun now fully risen overhead. Here we go, Naruto thought, already recalibrating his internal performance settings, already preparing contingencies for whatever question was about to come. Kakashi studied him for a long moment, saying nothing, his single visible eye unreadable in a way that made Naruto's pulse, despite every ounce of his considerable self-control, tick up ever so slightly. That stumble, Kakashi said finally, conversationally, as though remarking on the weather. Right before Sasuke closed in. Lucky timing. Guess I got lucky, believe it, Naruto said, grinning with exactly the right amount of oblivious pride. Kakashi's eye crinkled slightly. Not quite a smile, not quite suspicion, some third expression Naruto couldn't fully categorize despite his considerable experience reading facial cues. You know, I read your academy file before this test. Bottom of the class. Failed the graduation exam 3 times. Yeah, well, tests aren't really my thing, Naruto said, rubbing the back of his neck. Funny, Kakashi said, because your combat instincts today didn't look like someone who struggles with fundamentals. They looked like someone who understands tactical positioning better than most Chūnin I've worked with. Naruto's mind raced through response options at a speed that would have been genuinely alarming to anyone capable of observing it directly, weighing each option's plausibility, its risk of further scrutiny, its consistency with the persona he'd spent 4 years constructing. I don't know about all that, he said finally, forcing a slightly embarrassed laugh, scratching at his whiskered cheek. I just really wanted those bells. Guess sometimes wanting something bad enough makes you get lucky? It was, Naruto knew even as he said it, a thin explanation. Kakashi's single eye held his gaze for one more long, uncomfortable moment, a moment where Naruto genuinely calculated, with some discomfort, that there was perhaps a 15% chance his sensei had already seen through at least part of the performance. But then Kakashi shrugged, the moment passing, his posture relaxing back into its familiar, lazy slouch. Maybe, he said, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Get some rest, Naruto. Missions start tomorrow, and Konoha's D-rank assignments have a special way of humbling overconfident genin. D-rank? What's that mean? You'll see, Kakashi said, and with a small wave, vanished into a swirl of leaves, leaving Naruto alone in the training ground with the distinct, uncomfortable feeling that his mask, carefully maintained for 4 long years, had just developed its first genuinely concerning crack. That evening, Naruto sat once more at his desk, journal and notebook spread before him, but his mind, for the first time in weeks, wasn't focused on Uzushiogakures buried vaults or recursive barrier seals. It was focused on Kakashi Hataki's lingering, unreadable gaze. Recalculate risk assessment, he wrote, in his cramped, deliberately imperfect handwriting. Kakashi's observational threshold is higher than previously estimated. Continued exposure to his direct supervision increases probability of eventual detection. Estimated timeline for full mask failure under his observation, reduced from 18 months to approximately 6, assuming no additional corrective measures. 6 months. Naruto stared at that number for a long time, turning over the implications with the same rigor he applied to any strategic problem. 6 months wasn't nothing. It was more than enough time to make significant progress on Uzushiogakures reconstruction, if he was efficient, if he was careful, if he didn't make any further mistakes like today's poorly timed stumble. But it was also considerably less runway than he'd originally allotted himself, and it meant he needed to accelerate his plans for the ruins far sooner than he'd initially calculated. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began sketching a revised timeline. Missions with Team 7 during the day, structured to require minimal deviation from his established persona, and covert trips to the coastline whenever training schedules and D-rank assignments allowed even the smallest window of unsupervised time. It would be exhausting. It would require even more precise calculation, even more careful management of his cover story, even more meticulous attention to every small detail that might otherwise give him away. But as he glanced once more at his mother's journal, at that final decoded passage still fresh in his mind, "You are the last spiral, make it turn again," Naruto found himself, for once, not particularly concerned about exhaustion. He had a village to rebuild. And whatever Kakashi Hatake suspected, whatever cracks were beginning to show in a mask he'd spent 4 careful years constructing, Naruto intended to make sure that nothing, not a suspicious sensei, not a fearful village council, not even the specter of Danzō's ever-watchful root operatives, would stand between him and the ruins waiting patiently beneath the waves. He closed his notebook, extinguished the lamp, and allowed himself, finally, to sleep. D-rank missions, Naruto quickly discovered, were exactly as tedious as Kakashi's ominous warning had suggested. The first week of official genin work involved, in no particular order, retrieving a runaway cat named Tora from a tree with such single-minded aggression that Naruto genuinely questioned whether the animal had been trained specifically to hate shinobi, weeding an elderly woman's garden for 3 consecutive hours while she supervised from a chair with the watchful intensity of a jonin sensei, and painting a fence a specific, precise shade of white that the homeowner rejected twice before finally, grudgingly, accepting on the 3rd attempt. Sakura complained. Sasuke brooded. And Naruto, playing his part with the same exhausting precision he applied to every other aspect of his double life, grumbled loudly about wanting real ninja missions, while privately using every spare moment of downtime to refine his approach to the Uzushiogakure vault. This was, in its own strange way, harder than the reconnaissance itself. Because now, unlike before team placements, Naruto had exactly 0 unsupervised time. Kakashi structured their days with a jonin's efficient thoroughness, training in the mornings, D-rank assignments in the afternoons, and just enough downtime in between that any prolonged absence would be noticed within hours rather than days. Recalculate, Naruto thought, sitting cross-legged in his apartment on the 4th night after the bell test, mapping out the constraints of his new schedule against the timeline he needed for the Uzushiogakure project. Weekday windows, minimal. Weekend windows, larger, but still monitored. Kakashi has shown a pattern of unscheduled check-ins on rest days. Need a cover story robust enough to survive scrutiny from a jonin actively suspicious of behavioral inconsistencies. He settled, eventually, on a solution so mundane it bordered on elegant. He would tell his team, in casual conversation, that he'd taken up training alone on his days off, something no one would find remotely suspicious given his established persona as an overeager, undisciplined genin desperate to catch up to his more talented teammates. It fit the established narrative perfectly. It required no elaborate justification. And it gave him, if executed correctly, a full day at a time to travel to the coast and back. The only remaining variable was Kakashi himself, whose unscheduled check-ins represented a risk Naruto couldn't fully eliminate, only mitigate. He would need to be fast, efficient, and above all, careful never to return looking like anything other than a boy who'd spent his day failing to master tree-walking exercises in some isolated corner of the forest. The opportunity came on a rest day 9 days after the bell test, a stretch of unscheduled time that Kakashi had granted the team after an unusually grueling week of D-rank assignments, including a particularly memorable afternoon spent retrieving Tora the cat for the 3rd time. Naruto left Konoha before dawn, moving through the forest with the practiced silence of someone who'd spent considerable time studying stealth theory from stolen scrolls and cross-referencing it against his own extensive experimentation. He'd created 6 shadow clones before departing, a technique he'd secretly mastered to a degree far beyond what any academy student should have been capable of, though he was careful never to demonstrate more than a single, wobbly clone in front of his team, and disperse them throughout the village with specific instructions: maintain a visible, mundane presence at key locations throughout the day, ensure that anyone glancing in Naruto's general direction would see exactly what they expected to see. One clone loitered near a Chiraku ramen, ostensibly saving up for a large order. Another wandered the training grounds, practicing the same clumsy taijutsu forms Naruto's teammates had come to expect from him. A third simply sat on the Hokage monument, staring out at the village in a pose Naruto had calculated would read as brooding 12-year-old avoiding his teammates to any observer, without inviting closer scrutiny. It was, Naruto reflected as he slipped through the tree line toward the coast, an absurd amount of infrastructure required simply to buy himself a single day of freedom. But absurd or not, it worked. By the time the sun had fully risen, Naruto Uzumaki, the real one, the one currently sprinting through the forest at a pace no ordinary genin should have been capable of sustaining, was already several kilometers outside the village, moving fast and low, chakra carefully suppressed to avoid detection by any patrol that might cross his path. The journey to the coast took the better part of 4 hours, even at the accelerated pace Naruto maintained, and by the time the familiar cliff overlooking the ruins of Uzushiogakure came into view, the sun had climbed well past mid-morning. He paused at the cliff's edge, exactly as he had during his first visit, taking a moment to reassess the scene below with fresh eyes. The broken towers, the drowned streets, the faint, steady pulse of ancient chakra he detected beneath the sea floor weeks earlier, still there, still waiting, unchanged by the passage of time. No visible changes in the surface ruins, he noted, cataloging the scene with the same methodical precision he applied to any tactical assessment. No signs of recent intrusion, no fresh footprints, no disturbed vegetation along the accessible approach paths. Good. Nobody else has found this place. He made his way down a narrow, half-collapsed switchback trail that had clearly once been a proper stone staircase before decades of neglect and coastal erosion had reduced it to a treacherous scramble of loose rock and stubborn undergrowth. The descent took nearly 20 minutes, careful and deliberate, and by the time he reached the waterline, his sandals were soaked through with sea spray and his orange jacket carried a faint, salty dampness that would take hours to fully dry. Up close, the ruins were considerably more impressive, and considerably more haunting, than they'd appeared from the cliff above. Naruto waded through shin-deep water toward the nearest standing structure, a broken tower whose upper half had long since collapsed into the surrounding shallows, its remaining stonework still bearing, faintly, the unmistakable spiral crest of the Uzumaki clan. He reached out and touched the ancient stone, running his fingers along the weathered spiral, and felt something in his chest tighten with an emotion his analytical mind struggled, once again, to fully categorize. Focus, he told himself, pulling his hand back. Sentiment later. Survey first. Over the following 2 hours, Naruto conducted what amounted to a full tactical and structural survey of the accessible ruins, moving methodically from structure to structure, cataloging everything from the apparent age and material composition of each remaining building to the subtle chakra signatures still lingering faintly in certain stones, remnants, he suspected, of powerful sealing work performed decades ago, now slowly fading with time but not yet entirely gone. The old shrine his mother's journal had referenced proved more difficult to locate than he'd anticipated. Most of the ruins matched, at least loosely, with the fragmentary maps he'd assembled from Konoha's archives, but the shrine itself, described in his mother's coded passages as sitting where the old market once faced the sea, required considerably more searching than his initial calculations had predicted, owing largely to the fact that an entire section of the original coastline appeared to have subsided into the ocean sometime in the years since the village's destruction. He eventually found it nearly a full kilometer further along the shoreline than his projections had suggested, a squat, half-submerged structure that had clearly once been more substantial, its remaining walls barely rising above the current waterline, its roof entirely gone. But the moment Naruto stepped through what remained of its entrance, his careful, methodical survey came to an abrupt and startled halt. The interior of the shrine, despite its outward appearance of total ruin, was dry, not damp, not merely sheltered from the worst of the elements. Dry, in a way that made absolutely no logical sense given the structure's obvious exposure to decades of coastal weather and tidal flooding. Naruto crouched at the threshold, running his hand along the floor just inside the entrance, and felt the faint, unmistakable hum of active chakra beneath his palm, a barrier seal, still functioning after all these years, maintaining some kind of localized effect on the shrine's interior even as the structure around it crumbled into the sea. A moisture repulsion barrier, he thought, his mind racing through the implications with genuine, uncomplicated excitement now bleeding through his careful professional detachment, keyed to protect whatever's inside from water damage. Still active after, 15, 16 years? That's not just impressive fuinjutsu work. That's borderline impossible with anything less than a permanent, self-sustaining chakra source. He straightened, glancing around the shrine's small interior, barely large enough to comfortably fit 4 or 5 people standing shoulder to shoulder, and noted, with clinical precision, the faint spiral pattern etched into the center of the stone floor, nearly worn away by time but still visible if you knew exactly where to look. The spiral within the spiral, he thought, kneeling beside the pattern and tracing its edges with careful fingers. This is it. This is the entrance. What followed was, without exaggeration, the single most delicate and dangerous piece of fuinjutsu work Naruto had ever attempted. He'd spent weeks, months really, if he counted the time since first decoding his mother's journal, theorizing about the structure of the barrier seals protecting Uzushiogakures hidden vaults, developing and refining his understanding of recursive sealing architecture through nothing more than second-hand scrolls, secretly stolen fragments of advanced fuinjutsu theory, and his own considerable capacity for extrapolation. But theory and practice, Naruto now discovered, were two very different things when the cost of a miscalculation might be a barrier seal designed by the single most sophisticated sealing clan in recorded history reacting to an improper approach with lethal force. He knelt before the worn spiral pattern etched into the shrine floor, closed his eyes, and began the slow, careful process of extending his chakra outward in the specific resonance pattern he theorized would be necessary to activate the seal, a frequency keyed, according to his mother's cryptic notes, to Uzumaki bloodline signatures specifically. The first attempt produced nothing. No response. No shift in the ambient chakra of the shrine. Just silence, and the distant, rhythmic crash of waves against the ruins outside. Recalibrate, Naruto thought, opening his eyes and reassessing his approach. The resonance pattern needs to account for generational drift. Bloodline chakra signatures likely shift subtly across generations, even within the same clan. My signature won't match a template calibrated for my mother's generation, let alone earlier ones. He spent the better part of an hour experimenting with variations on the resonance pattern, adjusting the frequency and rhythm of his chakra output in small, careful increments, cross-referencing each failed attempt against his theoretical model and refining his approach accordingly. It was slow, methodical work, the kind of patient, iterative process that would have driven most people to frustrated distraction within the first 20 minutes, but which Naruto's endlessly analytical mind found, if anything, quietly satisfying. On his 11th attempt, something changed. The worn spiral pattern beneath his palms began to glow faintly, a soft blue light that seemed to rise up from somewhere deep beneath the shrine's foundation, and Naruto felt an answering pulse of chakra, old, vast, and unmistakably aware in some fundamental, non-sentient way, reach out and brush against his own chakra network like a question being asked. It's testing my signature, Naruto realized, holding perfectly still, careful not to disrupt whatever process was now unfolding. Comparing it against some kind of stored genetic chakra template. This is more sophisticated than anything I've read about in even the most advanced sealing texts. For nearly 30 seconds, nothing happened beyond that faint, questioning pulse, and Naruto found himself, despite every ounce of his careful analytical detachment, holding his breath. Then, with a low, grinding rumble that seemed to emanate from somewhere far beneath the shrine's foundation, the worn spiral pattern on the floor began, slowly, to rotate. The stone floor split open along the spiral's edges, revealing a narrow staircase descending into absolute darkness, and Naruto, heart pounding with an excitement his rational mind found almost embarrassing, allowed himself exactly 3 seconds of unrestrained triumph before forcing his focus back to the very real dangers that likely awaited below. Assume this is not the only layer of protection, he reminded himself, activating a small handheld light he brought specifically for this purpose. Nothing so advanced as proper fuinjutsu illumination. Just a simple, mundane torch, since drawing further attention with chakra-based light sources this deep into an unknown structure seemed like an unnecessary risk. Assume additional wards, traps, or guardian constructs may be present. Proceed with maximum caution. The staircase descended nearly 15 meters before leveling out into a narrow stone corridor, its walls lined with faded but still legible sealing script, protective formulas. Naruto noted as he studied them, designed primarily to reinforce the structural integrity of the passage against collapse and flooding rather than anything actively hostile. He moved forward slowly, testing each step before committing his full weight, his mind cataloging every visible seal and every subtle variation in the ambient chakra of the corridor with obsessive thoroughness. Twice, he paused to study formulas he didn't immediately recognize, filing them away for later analysis, additional pieces of Uzumaki's sealing knowledge that no scroll in Konoha's archives had ever documented. The corridor eventually opened into a larger chamber, and here, finally, Naruto's careful torch light revealed the true scope of what his mother's journal had promised. Shelves. Dozens of them, carved directly into the stone walls, each one lined with sealed scroll cases in various states of preservation, some clearly protected by their own localized barrier seals that had kept them pristine despite the passage of over a decade, others showing signs of gradual decay where whatever protective formula had once sustained them had finally begun to fail. At the center of the chamber stood a raised stone dais, and atop it, a single scroll case unlike any of the others, larger, more ornate, its surface etched with what Naruto immediately recognized as the personal seal of an Uzumaki elder, the kind of formal marking reserved for documents of genuine historical or clan significance. This is it, Naruto thought, approaching the dais with careful, measured steps, his mind already racing ahead to catalog and prioritize everything he was seeing. The last written record of who we were, just like she said. He spent nearly 3 hours in that chamber, moving methodically from shelf to shelf, carefully assessing each scroll case's condition and contents before deciding which items warranted immediate retrieval, and which could safely remain in place for a later, more thorough expedition. The central dais scroll, predictably, received his first and most careful attention. He lifted it with the reverent caution of someone handling something simultaneously priceless and potentially dangerous, and upon breaking the elder's seal, a process that took nearly 20 minutes of careful chakra manipulation to avoid triggering any embedded security measure, found himself looking at what appeared to be a genuine historical record of the Uzumaki clan's final years before Uzushiogakures' destruction. Names. Naruto scanned through page after page of them, family lineages meticulously documented in the same careful, formal handwriting, techniques passed down through generations, brief biographical notes on clan elders and their individual contributions to the village's sealing mastery. It was, in every sense, exactly what his mother's journal had promised, the last written record of an entire people, preserved against the possibility that everything else might someday be lost. He found, tucked near the back of the scroll, a section dedicated specifically to Fuinjutsu techniques considered too advanced or too dangerous for general clan use. Techniques requiring exceptional chakra, reserves and control, the kind of techniques that, Naruto noted with a flicker of grim understanding, likely explained at least part of why the allied villages had feared the Uzumaki enough to destroy them. Chakra chain techniques, he read, studying diagrams depicting what appeared to be physical manifestations of chakra used as both restraint and weapon. Barrier formulas capable of sealing away tailed beasts temporarily without a human vessel. Life force transfer seals. His eyes lingered on that last entry for a long moment, turning over the implications with careful, methodical consideration. This is why they were destroyed. Not because of what they'd done, because of what they were capable of doing. He continued through the remaining shelves with somewhat less reverence and considerably more practical urgency, cataloging scroll after scroll. Agricultural techniques adapted for coastal terrain, architectural formulas for tsunami-resistant construction, trade agreements and economic records detailing how the old village had sustained itself through Fuinjutsu craftsmanship rather than military might, medical sealing techniques that appeared, at a glance, to rival anything currently practiced in Konoha's own hospital. By the time his torch began flickering low on fuel, Naruto had assembled a mental inventory of the vault's contents comprehensive enough to fill several notebooks, and had physically retrieved only a small, carefully selected fraction of the total collection, enough to begin serious study without risking the structural integrity of removing too much from a chamber whose long-term stability he genuinely wasn't certain of. Priority selection, the central historical record. The chakra chain and barrier fundamentals. The agricultural and construction techniques most immediately relevant to rebuilding, He packed the selected scrolls carefully into a specially prepared, moisture-sealed satchel he'd brought specifically for this purpose, then paused at the chamber's threshold, glancing back one final time at the shelves still lined with generations of accumulated Uzumaki knowledge. "I'll be back," he thought, with a quiet, private certainty that felt less like a plan and more like a promise. For all of it, the climb back up to the shrine's surface level and the subsequent trek back toward the tree line consumed the last of the daylight, and Naruto found himself moving through the darkening forest with the particular urgency of someone acutely aware of exactly how much time had passed, and exactly how thin his cover story's margin for error had become. He paused briefly near the cliff overlooking the ruins, glancing back one final time at the drowned towers now barely visible in the gathering dusk, and allowed himself a moment of genuine, uncomplicated satisfaction before turning back toward Konoha. Phase 1, complete, he thought, adjusting the weight of the satchel on his back. Vault located, accessed, and partially catalogued. Confirmed viable resources for rebuilding, agricultural knowledge, construction techniques, medical sealing formulas, and cautiously, advanced defensive fuinjutsu. Next phase, establish physical presence and begin actual reconstruction. The journey back to the village took considerably longer than the outbound trip, exhaustion finally beginning to catch up with him after a full day of travel, careful infiltration, and hours of meticulous cataloging work. By the time the familiar walls of Konoha came into view, full darkness had settled over the forest, and Naruto's careful internal timeline had shrunk from a comfortable margin to something considerably tighter than he would have preferred. He dismissed his scattered shadow clones one by one as he approached the village, each dispersal delivering a brief, compressed burst of the day's mundane, unremarkable activities directly into his memory. Torin nearly clawing one clone's face off near the ramen stand, another clone spending several hours failing, with convincing authenticity, to properly execute a tree-walking exercise near the training grounds. Good, Naruto assessed, cross-referencing the accumulated memories against his planned cover story. Consistent with established behavioral baseline. No anomalies reported by any clone. Cover intact. He slipped back into the village proper just as the last of the evening market vendors were packing up their stalls, the smell of grilled fish and steamed vegetables lingering in the cooling night air, and made his way back toward his apartment with the exaggerated, exhausted slouch of a boy who genuinely spent his entire day on unproductive solo training. He didn't quite make it home unnoticed, however. Long day? Naruto nearly jumped out of his skin at the voice, spinning to find Kakashi leaning casually against a lamppost near the edge of the market district, his single visible eye regarding Naruto with an expression that gave away absolutely nothing. Recalculate. Immediately. Naruto's mind raced through contingencies at a speed that would have been genuinely disturbing to observe directly, cross-referencing every possible explanation for Kakashi's presence here, at this hour, against the actual, mundane truth of where he'd spent his day. "Kakashi-sensei," Naruto said, forcing a startled, slightly embarrassed grin. "Didn't see you there." "Yeah, I was training all day, tried working on the tree-walking exercise you mentioned, but I think I need way more practice." "Believe it." Kakashi's eye crinkled slightly, and he pushed off the lamppost, falling into an easy, unhurried pace beside Naruto as they continued through the darkening market street. "That satchel looks heavy," he observed, glancing pointedly at the bag slung across Naruto's shoulder. Unusual gear for tree-walking practice. Naruto felt something in his chest tighten, a genuine spike of alarm that, for once, he had to work to suppress rather than simply perform its opposite. He'd accounted for many possible complications during his return to the village, but a direct, specific question about the satchel from Kakashi himself hadn't ranked highly among his projected scenarios. Deflect. Don't over-explain. Keep it simple and plausible. "Oh, this?" Naruto said, patting the satchel with what he hoped was convincing nonchalance. "Found some old scrolls at a used shop near the edge of town. Figured I'd try teaching myself some new jutsus since apparently my fundamentals need work," he added, throwing in a small, resentful mimicry of Kakashi's earlier assessment for good measure. "Guess I got carried away and lost track of time looking through them." It was, Naruto knew even as he said it, a thinner explanation than he would have preferred, constructed hastily under pressure rather than carefully engineered in advance. But it was, at least, consistent with his established persona, a boy eager to prove himself, resourceful in his own scattered way, prone to losing track of time when something captured his interest. Kakashi studied him for a long moment, and Naruto forced himself to meet that single visible eye with the same open, slightly defensive expression any 12-year-old might wear when questioned by an authority figure about something ultimately harmless. A used scroll shop, Kakashi repeated slowly, in a tone that made it unclear whether he was genuinely considering the explanation or simply allowing Naruto to think he was. Which shop? Danger. Specific follow-up question requiring specific, verifiable answer. Naruto's mind raced through Konoha's actual commercial district, cross-referencing every scroll and curio shop he'd ever passed or heard mentioned, settling quickly on a small, genuinely obscure establishment near the village's eastern edge that he knew, from prior observation, kept irregular hours and dealt primarily in low-value academic texts rather than anything a jonin would think twice about. That little place by the eastern gate, run by the old guy with the eye patch, Naruto said, keeping his tone casual, almost bored. To know the name. Sells a bunch of random junk, mostly old academy stuff nobody wants anymore. Kakashi's expression remained unreadable for another long, uncomfortable moment, and then, unexpectedly, he simply shrugged, the tension in the conversation dissolving as quickly as it had risen. Sounds about right for the neighborhood, he said, and Naruto felt something in his chest loosen, just slightly, with cautious relief. Just be careful with unverified scrolls, Naruto. Some old text carry seals that misfire on inexperienced hands. Wouldn't want my genin blowing off a finger over some bargain bin jutsu. Alright. Of course, sensei, Naruto said, injecting just the right note of sheepish embarrassment into his voice. Kakashi nodded, and with a small, lazy wave, turned and ambled off into the evening crowd, leaving Naruto standing alone on the market street with his heart still hammering faster than he would have liked to admit. He made it back to his apartment without further incident, locking the door behind him and setting the satchel carefully on his desk before allowing himself, finally, to fully process the events of the day. Assessment, he wrote, pulling out his notebook despite the exhaustion weighing on every muscle in his body. Vault successfully located and accessed. Significant resources retrieved. Cover story held under direct questioning from Kakashi-sensei, though the encounter confirms his suspicion level remains elevated. Recommend reducing frequency of extended absences and increasing quality of alibi infrastructure going forward. He glanced at the satchel, at the scrolls now safely tucked away within it. Generations of Uzumaki knowledge, preserved against every expectation that it would ever be recovered. Waiting now for a 12-year-old boy with a mask made of orange jumpsuits and loud laughter to decide what came next. Phase 2, he thought, pulling out a fresh sheet of paper despite his exhaustion, his mind already racing ahead to the next set of calculations. Establish a more robust cover for extended absences. Recruit assistants, if any trustworthy candidates exist. Begin actual physical reconstruction before the window of opportunity narrows any further. He thought briefly of the old fisherman he noticed on his first visit to the ruins weeks earlier, a distant figure mending nets on a small boat near the edge of the drowned coastline, someone whose presence he noted and filed away without further investigation at the time. Worth reconsidering, he wrote, underlining the thought twice. Local knowledge. Potential ally. Requires careful vetting before any approach. Outside his window, Konoha's evening had settled into full darkness, the distant sounds of the village winding down for the night carrying faintly through the cool air. Naruto set down his pencil, glanced once more at the satchel of recovered scrolls sitting on his desk, and allowed himself, finally, a small, genuine smile. One step closer, he thought, extinguishing his lamp and settling into bed despite the excited hum of his still racing mind. Just one step closer. The days following Naruto's first successful infiltration of the vault settled into a rhythm that would have exhausted a fully grown adult, let alone a 12-year-old academy graduate juggling the demands of active genin duty alongside a secret nation-building project. Mornings belonged to Team 7, training exercises with Kakashi that grew steadily more demanding as their sensei worked to shape 3 raw genin into something resembling a cohesive unit, followed by the tedious parade of D-rank missions that filled their afternoons with weeding, painting, and the increasingly personal vendetta that seemed to exist between Naruto and a certain fire-hued cat named Tora. Evenings, when his body wasn't simply too exhausted to function, belonged to study, poring over the recovered scrolls by lamplight, cross-referencing agricultural formulas against economic theory, sketching preliminary architectural concepts against what little he understood of Uzushiogakures' original title engineering. And rest days, the increasingly precious, increasingly scrutinized rest days, belonged to the coast. Naruto had, in the weeks since his first vault expedition, refined his cover story considerably. Rather than the thin, hastily constructed used scroll shop explanation he'd offered Kakashi under pressure, he'd invested actual effort into building a plausible secondary life, a genuine, if minor, arrangement with the elderly, eye-patched shop owner near the eastern gate, a man named Kotaro who dealt in exactly the kind of unremarkable second-hand texts Naruto had claimed to be studying, and who, for a small but steady stream of Naruto's D-rank earnings, was more than happy to vouch for a young customer's frequent visits and occasional overnight study sessions in the shop's cramped back room. It wasn't quite lying. Naruto genuinely did visit Kotaro's shop, genuinely did purchase a handful of unremarkable scrolls to maintain the fiction, and genuinely did spend a portion of his evenings there, ostensibly studying. The old man, for his part, asked no questions beyond what was strictly necessary for commerce, which suited Naruto's purposes perfectly. A cover story is only as strong as its weakest verifiable point, Naruto had written in his notebook after finalizing the arrangement. Kotaro's shop provides a verifiable, low-scrutiny alibi. Actual absences from the village remain the primary vulnerability. Recommend minimizing frequency while maximizing efficiency per trip. Efficiency, as it turned out, was about to become considerably more important than Naruto had initially anticipated, because the scope of what he intended to accomplish had grown. In the weeks since his first vault expedition, from recover some scrolls into something considerably more ambitious, he intended to rebuild an entire village. The scale of that ambition became fully apparent to Naruto on the evening he sat down, surrounded by the recovered scrolls spread across every available surface of his small apartment, and attempted to translate generations of Uzumaki knowledge into something resembling an actual, executable plan. It was, he quickly realized, nothing like planning a mission or engineering a bell test. A mission had a defined objective, clear parameters, a finite scope. Rebuilding a nation, even a small one, even one populated by nobody but himself for the foreseeable future, required accounting for variables that stretched across every conceivable discipline: agriculture, architecture, defense, economics, governance, education, medicine. Naruto approached the problem the only way his methodical mind knew how, by breaking it down into its component parts and addressing each one systematically. Agriculture first, he decided, pulling out the recovered scroll detailing coastal farming techniques adapted for Uzushiogakures' unique tidal geography. The old Uzumaki, it turned out, had developed an ingenious system of terrace, brackish water-resistant rice paddies combined with carefully cultivated seaweed farms, supplemented by a rotation of hardy root vegetables suited to the region's salt-heavy soil. It was a self-sufficient system, requiring minimal ongoing labor once established, and, critically, it didn't require importing supplies from anywhere else in the elemental nations, which meant it wouldn't attract attention from merchants or officials curious about a sudden demand for unusual goods. Construction second. The architectural scrolls proved even more impressive than Naruto had initially estimated. Detailed formulas for tsunami-resistant foundations using a combination of physical engineering and reinforcing chakra seals woven directly into load-bearing stonework. Techniques that would allow even a handful of workers to construct genuinely durable structures far faster than conventional methods would allow. Defense third, though here Naruto proceeded with considerably more caution, given what he'd already gleaned about the more dangerous Fuinjutsu techniques buried within the vault. He had no intention of recreating anything resembling the chakra chain restraint techniques or life force transfer seals he'd catalogued during his first visit, not yet, and possibly not ever, given the political and ethical weight such techniques carried. But simpler defensive barrier seals, the kind designed to obscure a location's chakra signature from external detection or discourage casual intruders without inflicting serious harm, seemed both achievable and prudent. Economics fourth, and this, Naruto suspected, represented the single most delicate variable in his entire plan. Consider, for a moment, the fundamental problem facing any attempt to rebuild a destroyed nation from scratch: even with unlimited knowledge and unlimited labor. A settlement needs some means of sustaining itself economically, some reason for its continued existence to make sense to the wider world rather than inviting suspicion or, worse, active interference from the very villages that had destroyed it in the first place. Naruto had spent considerable time turning this problem over in his mind during the quiet hours of the previous week, and had arrived at a conclusion that, he suspected, would have made his mother, the woman whose handwriting filled the journal now permanently tucked beneath his floorboards, genuinely proud. Uzushiogakure would not rebuild as a military power. Not initially, and possibly not ever in any form that would draw the attention or concern of the great shinobi villages. Instead, it would rebuild as something considerably more subtle, a trading settlement, specializing in exactly the kind of high-value, low-visibility goods that the old Uzumaki clan had always been famous for. Fuinjutsu craftsmanship, carefully packaged as simple, unremarkable sealwork, storage scrolls, preservation seals for perishable goods, minor protective wards, sold not as weapons or forbidden clan techniques, but as practical, everyday tools that any merchant or traveler might reasonably want. Textiles, woven using techniques adapted from the vault's agricultural scrolls, dyed using the region's naturally occurring mineral deposits into distinctive patterns that no other settlement in the elemental nations could easily replicate. Tea, cultivated from a hardy variety the old scrolls indicated had once grown abundantly along the coastal hillsides before the village's destruction, prized in the journal's margin notes, for a flavor profile unlike anything grown further inland. None of it, individually, would draw significant attention. All of it together would provide a sustainable economic foundation for a settlement that had no need, and crucially, no apparent ambition, to challenge anyone's political or military standing. The old Uzumaki fell because they built power the great villages could see and fear, Naruto wrote, working through the logic methodically in his notebook. Rebuild power the great villages can't see, don't fear, and have no reason to investigate. Quiet prosperity, not visible strength. It was, in its own way, an application of the exact same principle that governed Naruto's own carefully maintained persona, the recognition that visibility invited scrutiny, and scrutiny invited danger, and the safest path forward was almost always the one that looked, from the outside, like nothing worth noticing at all. Theory, however useful, could only carry a plan so far, and Naruto's next rest day found him once again making the long journey toward the coast. This time with a considerably more specific objective than simple exploration. He needed labor. Even with his own considerable chakra reserves and his mastery of the shadow clone technique, a mastery he developed, in secret, to a degree that would have shocked even Kakashi, capable of maintaining dozens of clones for hours at a stretch without significant depletion, a single boy, however capable, could not realistically rebuild an entire settlement alone. He needed hands. He needed, ideally, people who already possessed some connection to the old village, whose presence wouldn't raise the same questions an outsider's involvement inevitably would. Which was why, on this particular visit, Naruto found himself approaching not the ruins themselves, but the small fishing boat he noticed anchored near the edge of the drowned coastline during his very first exploratory trip weeks earlier. The boat's owner turned out to be an old man, weathered by decades of sun and salt air, mending a torn net with the patient, unhurried movements of someone who'd performed the same task 10,000 times before. He looked up as Naruto approached, squinting slightly against the midday glare, his expression carrying the particular wariness of someone unaccustomed to visitors in this remote stretch of coastline. Not many folks come out this way, the old man said, his voice carrying the rough, salt-worn quality of a lifetime spent near the sea. Especially not kids in orange jackets. Name's Naruto, Naruto said, offering a friendly, disarming grin, though behind that grin, his mind was already running through a careful assessment of the man before him, aged somewhere in his 60s, calloused hands consistent with decades of manual labor, a faint, distinctive tattoo just visible on his forearm beneath his rolled sleeve that Naruto's practiced eye immediately recognized as a stylized variant of the Uzumaki spiral, worn and faded but unmistakable to anyone who'd spent the past several weeks studying every surviving fragment of Uzumaki iconography he could find. Confirmed, Naruto thought, his pulse quickening slightly despite his outward calm. Uzumaki descent, or close clan affiliation. This is exactly the kind of candidate I was hoping to find. Renji, the old man offered, after a long, appraising pause. What brings a Konoha kid all the way out here? Ain't nothing but old rocks and bad memories. Just exploring, Naruto said, keeping his tone light, casual, giving nothing away. Heard there used to be a whole village out here. Uzushiogakure, right? My mom used to tell me stories. Something shifted in Renji's weathered expression at the mention of the old village's name, a flicker of old grief, quickly masked, that Naruto's careful eye caught and filed away as significant. Your mother knew about this place? Renji asked, setting down his net-mending work entirely now, giving Naruto his full attention. That's more than most folks from the Fire Country bother remembering. She was from here, actually, Naruto said, watching the old man's reaction carefully. Uzumaki. Chūnin Uzumaki. Guess that makes me one too. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Naruto began cataloging contingencies for how to proceed if the revelation produced an unfavorable reaction. But when Renji finally spoke, his voice carried something Naruto hadn't quite anticipated, a rough, unmistakable note of emotion. Kushina, the old man repeated slowly, as though testing the weight of a name he hadn't spoken aloud in years. Little Kushina Uzumaki. I remember her. Loudest kid in the whole village, temper like a wildfire, hair red as fresh blood. He studied Naruto's face with fresh intensity, and something in his expression softened considerably. You've got her eyes, boy. Didn't notice it before, but you've got 'em. What followed was a conversation that consumed the better part of 2 hours. Renji, it turned out, had been a minor merchant in the old village before its destruction, one of a scattered handful of Uzushiogakure survivors who'd managed to escape the coordinated attack that leveled the settlement, and who'd spent the subsequent decades drifting through various fishing villages along the coast, never quite settling, never quite able to leave the region entirely despite having no home left to return to. Why not go back? Renji had asked at one point, genuine curiosity mixing with something that sounded almost like hope. Go back to Konoha, I mean. Grow up safe. Whatever's left out here, it's just rocks and ghosts. Because ghosts deserve better than being forgotten, Naruto said, and found, to his mild surprise, that the words came out with more genuine conviction than his usual careful performance typically allowed. My mom left me a journal. Told me the vaults survived. Told me it was up to me to decide what Uzushiogakure could still be. He watched Renji's face carefully as he spoke, weighing the old man's reaction, calculating the probability that this conversation would end in either a useful ally or a well-meaning attempt to drag Naruto back to Konoha and report the whole affair to some concerned authority figure. But Renji, after a long, considering silence, simply nodded slowly, something resolute settling into his weathered features. Your mother would be proud, you know, he said quietly. She used to talk about rebuilding back before everything happened. Big dreams for such a small girl. Guess dreams don't die just because the dreamer does. Does that mean you'll help? Naruto asked, allowing a genuine note of hope to color his voice, not entirely a performance, this time. Renji studied him for another long moment, then let out a slow, weathered sigh that seemed to carry the weight of decades. I'm an old man with nothing left to lose and nowhere else I'd rather be, he said. If an Uzumaki's asking me to help rebuild what we lost, seems like the least I can do is say yes. Over the following weeks, Renji proved to be exactly the kind of ally Naruto's careful calculations had hoped to find, not merely a source of physical labor, though his decades of practical experience with coastal construction and fishing proved invaluable, but a genuine repository of institutional knowledge about the old village that no scroll in the vault could have provided. He remembered, in fragments and stories shared during the long hours of quiet work that followed, details about Uzushiogakures' actual daily life that Naruto's theoretical research had entirely missed. The specific tidal patterns that determined the best times for seaweed harvesting, the informal social customs that had governed disputes between neighboring households, the particular way the old village markets had structured trade to avoid the kind of visible wealth accumulation that might attract unwanted attention from the wider shinobi world. We were never trying to be a military power, Renji explained one afternoon, as the two of them worked to clear rubble from what had once been the village's central market square, Naruto's shadow clones providing considerably more labor capacity than any observer would have expected from a single 12-year-old. Whatever the other villages thought, whatever fear drove them to do what they did, We just wanted to build something good. Something quiet. Guess quiet wasn't good enough for people who saw our seals and got scared of what we might become. Naruto absorbed every detail of these conversations with the same methodical thoroughness he applied to any other data source, cross-referencing Renji's recollections against the recovered scrolls, refining his rebuilding plans with each new piece of practical insight. By the end of the third week of their partnership, the theoretical blueprint Naruto had sketched out in his notebook had evolved into something considerably more concrete, a phased construction plan, prioritizing the restoration of basic shelter and agricultural infrastructure before any more ambitious architectural projects, a rough economic model built around the trade goods he'd identified weeks earlier, and thanks to Renji's patient tutoring, a much clearer picture of the social customs and governance structures that had once defined Uzushiogakure as a genuine community rather than merely a collection of buildings. Phase 1 construction targets, Naruto wrote, late one evening after returning from a particularly productive session with Renji. Basic shelter for initial population, estimate 2 to 3 structures sufficient for now. Restoration of primary agricultural terracing, estimate 6 weeks with current labor capacity. Establishment of a basic defensive perimeter seal to obscure the settlement's presence from casual chakra detection. He paused, glancing at that last line, and added a note beneath it. Population currently 0 beyond Renji and myself. Requires further recruitment before settlement designation is meaningfully accurate. That particular problem, Naruto suspected, would resolve itself sooner than his careful projections currently anticipated, though not in a manner he'd specifically planned for. Back in Konoha, meanwhile, Naruto's carefully managed absence from the village's social fabric had not gone entirely unnoticed by the two teammates, whose observational capabilities he'd initially estimated as considerably less concerning than Kakashi's. He's definitely hiding something, Sakura said one afternoon, seated beside Sasuke on a bench overlooking the training ground while Kakashi ran Naruto through an individual taijutsu drill some distance away. I mean, more than usual. He's been disappearing on every rest day for weeks now, and that story about studying at some old scroll shop doesn't really add up. Sasuke, who'd said nothing for the better part of 10 minutes, finally offered a non-committal grunt that Sakura had learned, over the past several weeks of team interaction, to interpret as cautious agreement rather than simple dismissal. You've noticed it too? She pressed. His chakra control has been improving too fast, Sasuke said finally, his dark eyes tracking Naruto's movements across the training ground with the same analytical intensity he applied to any potential rival's technique. Faster than someone who supposedly can't even manage a basic clone jutsu should be capable of. Naruto would have been considerably more alarmed to learn had he been present for this particular conversation. Precisely the kind of observation his careful mask was designed to prevent, and precisely the kind of observation that two above-average genin, spending significant time in close proximity to him on a daily basis, were increasingly well-positioned to make. You think he's, secretly training somewhere? Sakura asked, frowning slightly as she considered the possibility. Maybe, Sasuke said. Or maybe he's just gotten better at hiding what he's actually capable of. He paused, something flickering behind his dark eyes that might have been grudging respect, might have been simple suspicion. Either way, something's off. I'm going to figure out what. Neither of them, fortunately for Naruto's carefully constructed cover story, had any immediate plans to act on this suspicion beyond quiet observation. But the mere fact that both of his teammates had independently arrived at the conclusion that something didn't add up represented exactly the kind of compounding risk Naruto's calculations had been designed to minimize, and exactly the kind of risk that was, despite his best efforts, proving increasingly difficult to fully contain. It was not, however, Sasuke or Sakura's growing suspicion that represented the most immediate threat to Naruto's carefully maintained secret, though he wouldn't learn the full scope of that particular danger for several more days. Some considerable distance from Konoha, in a nondescript office buried deep within a section of the village that officially didn't appear on any public map, a masked root operative knelt before a bandaged, one-eyed figure whose very presence seemed to draw the shadows of the room closer around him. Unusual chakra fluctuations detected along the eastern coastline, the operative reported, voice carefully neutral in the manner all of Danzō's agents had been trained to cultivate. Consistent, low-level activity, recurring on an irregular but sustained schedule over the past several weeks. Location corresponds approximately to the historical territory of Uzushiogakure. Danzō's single visible eye remained fixed on some middle distance, his expression revealing nothing of whatever calculations were unfolding behind it. Uzushiogakure, he repeated slowly, the name carrying decades of complicated history that few in the village were positioned to fully appreciate. The Uzumaki homeland, destroyed for good reason, if I recall the historical assessments correctly. Shall I dispatch a scout to investigate further, Danzō-sama? A long silence stretched through the dim room before Danzō finally responded, his single eye narrowing slightly with the particular calculation of a man who'd spent decades treating even the smallest anomaly as a potential asset or threat, requiring careful assessment. Yes, he said finally. Quietly. I want to know precisely what's generating that chakra signature before we determine whether it represents an opportunity or a problem requiring more direct correction. The operative bowed and vanished without further comment, leaving Danzō alone in his dim office, his single eye finally drifting toward a shelf lined with old, carefully preserved reports. Had anyone been present to observe them, that included a considerably more detailed and current assessment of one Naruto Uzumaki's academy performance, behavioral patterns, and recent shifts in observable capability, then the boy himself would have found remotely comfortable. Uzumaki, Danzō murmured to himself, in the empty quiet of his office, turning the name over with the same patient calculation he applied to every piece on his considerable political chessboard. Let's see what you're really building out there, boy. Naruto, blissfully unaware of the route scout now making quiet preparations to investigate the very coastline he'd spent the past month carefully cultivating, spent that same evening seated across from Renji at a small, weathered table the old man had salvaged from the ruins, going over the latest revisions to their construction timeline by the light of a single oil lamp. 6 weeks for the agricultural terracing, Renji said, tracing a callous finger along the rough sketch Naruto had drawn out on a scrap of parchment. That's optimistic, even with those clone tricks of yours doing the heavy lifting. Terrain's rougher than you're giving it credit for. I've accounted for a 15% margin of error, Naruto said, adjusting the sketch slightly. If we prioritize the eastern terraces first, where the old irrigation channels are still partially intact, we can compress the initial timeline considerably compared to starting from a completely blank foundation. Renji chuckled, a low, weathered sound. You talk like a merchant's accountant, you know that? Kushina used to talk like that too, when she got excited about something. All numbers and margins and timelines. He shook his head, something fond and sad mixing in his expression. Guess some things really do run in the blood. Naruto felt something flicker in his chest at that observation, a warmth he hadn't fully anticipated, a small, private confirmation that whatever mask he wore for the rest of the world here, in this small circle of trust he'd carefully and deliberately built, he didn't need to perform quite so completely. There's someone else, Renji said, after a comfortable silence had settled between them, the old man's expression turning thoughtful. A girl, not much older than you, lost her whole family in the attack, same as most of us who survived. Been living rough near the old fishing settlements up the coast for years now, never really had anywhere to belong. If you're serious about rebuilding, about making this place something more than just you and one old fisherman, she might be worth reaching out to. Naruto's mind immediately began cataloging the implications of this new information, weighing the potential value of additional population against the additional risk any new recruit inevitably introduced to his carefully managed secret. What's her name? He asked. Ki, Renji said. Sharp kid. Angry, understandably, but sharp. If anyone out here's got Uzumaki blood running through her stubbornness, it's her. Naruto considered this for a long moment, turning the name over in his mind alongside every calculation he'd already run about population growth, labor capacity, and the delicate balance between building something real and maintaining the secrecy that kept it safe from a village that had already destroyed this place once before. Introduce us, he said finally. If she's willing to help build something instead of just surviving in the ruins of what got taken from her, I want to meet her. Outside, unseen and unsuspected by either of them, a lone figure in a root mask crouched in the shadow of a distant rock formation, patiently observing the faint glow of Renji's oil lamp flickering in the darkness of the ruined shrine, cataloging every detail of the scene for a report that would, within days, land directly on Danzō's desk. The blueprint for a nation was taking shape. But so, unbeknownst to its architect, was the first real threat to its survival. The introduction to Ki did not go quite the way Naruto had planned. He'd expected, based on Renji's description and his own careful projections of probable temperament for a war orphan who'd spent years surviving alone in the ruins of her ancestral homeland, a cautious, perhaps guarded reception. What he had not fully accounted for was the kunai currently pressed against his throat, courtesy of a girl who dropped from the shattered remains of a rooftop with a speed and precision that made Naruto's analytical mind immediately reassess several of his prior assumptions. "Renji," the girl said, without taking her eyes off Naruto or easing the pressure of her blade even slightly, "you brought a Konoha shinobi to my territory?" "Kid," Renji started, hands raised in placating fashion. "He's got the forehead protector, old man. I can see it from here." Naruto, for his part, remained perfectly still, cataloging the situation with the same clinical thoroughness he applied to any tactical assessment. Even as a girl who couldn't have been more than 13 held a very sharp blade uncomfortably close to his jugular. She was thin, too thin, in the way that spoke of years of unreliable food sources rather than any natural build, with dark, choppy hair cut unevenly, as though she'd hacked at it herself with the same kunai currently threatening Naruto's throat. Her clothes were patched and weathered but practical, and beneath the dirt and salt-worn fabric, Naruto noted the telltale flash of a faded spiral pattern stitched into the collar of her shirt, the same Uzumaki crest that had first confirmed Renji's heritage weeks earlier. Combat reflexes considerably above what her apparent age and circumstances would suggest, Naruto assessed, even as he kept his expression carefully calm, non-threatening. Self-taught, likely, survival necessity rather than formal training. Proceed carefully, hostile but not irrational. Reasoning, not force, is the correct approach here. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," Naruto said slowly, keeping his hands visible and still. "I'm Uzumaki. Same as you, I'm guessing, from that crest on your collar." The kunai wavered, just slightly. "Lots of people know about the crest," Keith said, though her voice carried marginally less certainty than a moment before. "Doesn't mean anything. My mother was Kushina Uzumaki," Naruto continued, watching her face carefully for any reaction. "She died the night I was born. Left me a journal about this place, about the vaults, about rebuilding what got taken from us. I've been out here for weeks now, working with Renji, trying to actually do something about it instead of just letting this place stay a graveyard." For a long, tense moment, nothing happened, Kid's dark eyes studying him with an intensity that reminded Naruto, uncomfortably, of the same scrutiny Kakashi had leveled at him after the bell test. Then, slowly, she lowered the kunai, though she didn't sheath it entirely. "Prove it," she said. "The bloodline. Prove you're actually Uzumaki, not just some kid Konoha sent out here to scout for whatever's still buried in these ruins." Naruto considered his options carefully. A direct chakra demonstration seemed the most immediately convincing approach, but also carried risk, revealing too much of his actual capability, even to a potential ally, ran counter to every careful calculation he'd made about controlling information flow. But a girl this suspicious, this battle-hardened, wasn't likely to accept a half measure. He settled on a middle path. Focusing his chakra with practiced control, he allowed a faint, visible pulse of his considerable reserves to manifest, not the overwhelming, densely coiled chakra that marked his status as a Jinchuriki, which he kept carefully suppressed and separated from view, but simply the distinctive, vibrant quality of Uzumaki life force chakra, the kind Renji had described to him weeks earlier, as instantly recognizable to anyone who'd grown up around it. Kid's eyes widened slightly, and something in her rigid posture eased, just fractionally. "That's..." She started, then stopped, seeming to war with herself before continuing. "That's real. That's actually Uzumaki chakra. I haven't felt that since..." She cut herself off, jaw tightening, old grief flickering behind eyes that had clearly learned, through hard necessity, to mask emotion as thoroughly as Naruto himself had. "Since your family," Naruto said quietly, not a question. Kid said nothing for a long moment, finally sheathing her kunai fully and crossing her arms, though her posture remained tense, guarded. "Renji says you've got some plan," she said instead, deflecting with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years avoiding painful subjects. "Says you actually think you can rebuild this place. That true, or is this just some kid's fantasy that's gonna get us all in trouble with Konoha?" "It's true," Naruto said, and found, once again, that the conviction in his voice required no performance at all. I've got the vault scrolls. Agricultural techniques, construction formulas, defensive seals. I've got a working timeline. What I don't have is enough hands to actually build it, which is where you'd come in, if you're willing. Keith studied him for a long moment, glancing briefly at Renji, who offered a small, encouraging nod before turning her attention back to Naruto with an expression that had shifted, subtly, from hostility towards something more complicated, cautious, wary hope, perhaps, the kind that comes from someone who's been disappointed too many times to trust it easily. I've been surviving out here alone for 3 years, she said finally, scavenging, fishing, staying just far enough from any patrol routes that nobody bothers investigating, a kid living in ruins nobody cares about. I don't need charity, and I definitely don't need some Konoha genin playing hero with my home. I'm not offering charity, Naruto said. I'm offering work. Actual, hard, exhausting work, rebuilding something that matters. If you don't want to do it, that's your call. But I'm not going anywhere, and neither is this place. Might as well be part of building it instead of just watching it happen. Another long silence stretched between them, the distant crash of waves against the ruins the only sound filling the gap, and then, finally, Keith let out a slow breath, something in her shoulders loosening incrementally. Fine, she said. Show me this plan of yours. If it's actually good, I'll help. If it's some half-baked kid's fantasy, I'm going right back to my usual routine and forgetting this conversation happened. Naruto, for the first time in longer than he could remember, allowed himself a genuine, unguarded smile. Keith's assessment of the plan, once Naruto walked her through the accumulated weeks of research, timeline projections, and salvaged scroll knowledge, proved considerably more favorable than her initial skepticism had suggested, though she peppered the explanation with a stream of sharp, practical questions that Naruto found, to his private satisfaction, forced him to refine several assumptions he hadn't fully stress-tested. Your agricultural timeline doesn't account for the tide cycles properly, she pointed out, studying his sketch terracing plan with a critical eye. The eastern channels flood twice a month with the higher tides. You build there without accounting for that, you'll lose half your seedlings to saltwater intrusion before they even take root. Naruto felt something click into place, cross-referencing her observation against the scroll data he'd been working from. You're right, he said, already revising the plan in his head. The old irrigation scrolls mentioned tidal gates, but I hadn't connected the maintenance schedule to the actual planting timeline. That's a significant correction. Thank you. Keith blinked, apparently unprepared for such an immediate, uncomplicated acceptance of criticism. Most people don't just say thank you when you tell them they're wrong, she said, studying him with renewed curiosity. Being wrong and staying wrong are two different problems, Naruto said, already sketching a revision to the terracing timeline. One's just information. The other's a choice. It was, Naruto reflected privately, one of the very few moments in recent memory where he'd allowed a piece of his actual analytical philosophy to surface without the careful filtering he applied to every interaction back in Konoha, and something about Keith's directness, her lack of any preconceived narrative about who Naruto Uzumaki was supposed to be, made the slip feel considerably less risky than it would have with anyone else. By the time the three of them, Naruto, Renji, and their newest, still cautious recruit, had finished refining the construction timeline late into the afternoon, the outline of an actual, workable settlement had begun to take shape on Naruto's increasingly annotated parchment. Agricultural terracing timed properly around tidal patterns. A small cluster of initial shelters positioned on the most structurally stable ground still available in the ruins, and a defensive perimeter seal that Naruto had begun quietly experimenting with, based on formulas recovered from the vault, designed specifically to obscure the settlement's chakra signature from casual external detection. That last part, Keith said, studying the perimeter seal notation with obvious interest. How's it supposed to work exactly? Chakra masking, Naruto explained. Not full invisibility. Nothing's ever completely undetectable to a sufficiently determined observer. But it should reduce our ambient signature enough that any routine patrol or passing shinobi wouldn't register anything worth investigating. It's not perfect. But it should buy us time. He didn't mention, in that moment, exactly how urgently he suspected they might need that time, the growing unease he'd felt over the past several days, A nagging analytical instinct that something about his increasingly frequent absences from Konoha had begun accumulating risk faster than his careful calculations had originally projected. Construction, once the revised timeline was finalized, began in earnest the following week, though construction, Naruto quickly discovered, required considerably more infrastructure than simply showing up with a shovel and good intentions. He arrived at the ruins on his next available rest day with nearly 30 shadow clones dispersed the moment he crossed the tree lanes surrounding the coastal approach, each one immediately setting to work on a different component of the initial construction phase, clearing rubble from the designated shelter sites, reinforcing the crumbling foundation of the old market square, carefully applying the tsunami-resistant construction seals he'd spent the previous week practicing on smaller, less consequential test structures back in his apartment. Kid, predictably skeptical of Naruto's claimed clone capacity until she witnessed it firsthand, stood at the edge of the construction site with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and grudging respect as she watched 24 identical Naruto clones methodically clearing debris with the coordinated efficiency of a small, well-organized labor crew. Okay, she admitted finally, arms crossed, that's actually impressive. How are you not dead from chakra exhaustion right now? Chakra reserves considerably above academy average, Naruto said, which was, if anything, a significant understatement he had no intention of elaborating on further. Comes with the territory, I guess. Renji, meanwhile, had taken charge of directing the actual construction work itself, his decades of practical building experience proving invaluable in translating Naruto's theoretical scroll knowledge into genuinely sound, structurally reliable work. Under his guidance, the clones methodically cleared and reinforced the foundation of what would become the settlement's first proper shelter, a modest, single-story structure built from salvaged stone and reinforced with the sealing techniques recovered from the vault, designed to withstand both the region's occasional storms and the ever-present threat of tidal flooding. By the end of that first full day of dedicated construction, the skeleton of an actual building had begun to take shape amid the ruins. Nothing grand. Nothing that would have impressed a Konoha architect accustomed to the village's elaborate residential compounds, but real, solid, and unmistakably the first tangible step towards something more than scattered rubble and old memories. It's not much, Naruto said, studying the partially completed structure as the sun began sinking toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the construction site. It's a start, Kid said, and there was something in her voice, a quiet, cautious warmth that hadn't been present during their first tense meeting, that suggested she meant it as more than simple politeness. First real thing built out here in years that wasn't just me patching together scraps to survive another season. The following weeks fell into an increasingly demanding but productive rhythm. Naruto's rest days, still carefully limited by the constraints of his Team 7 obligations, still requiring the same elaborate cover story infrastructure he'd painstakingly constructed weeks earlier, became dedicated construction sessions, his shadow clones providing the bulk of the physical labor while Renji's practical expertise and Kid's sharp, detail-oriented feedback refined every aspect of the growing settlement's design. By the end of the third week, the first shelter stood complete, modest but genuinely sturdy, its walls reinforced with sealing formulas that Naruto had personally verified against the original vault scrolls. Its foundation properly elevated above the flood line Kid had identified during their earlier planning sessions. A second structure, intended as a shared workspace and storage facility, had begun rising alongside it, and the eastern agricultural terraces, the ones Kid had correctly identified as requiring careful attention to tidal patterns, showed the first tentative signs of successful cultivation. Hardy root vegetables and salt-resistant rice seedlings taking root in soil that had lain fallow for over a decade. You know, Renji said one evening, as the three of them sat around a small fire near the completed shelter, sharing a simple meal of grilled fish and rice that Kid had prepared with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent years cooking for herself in far less comfortable circumstances. This is starting to actually look like something. It's still just 3 people and a couple of half-finished buildings, Kid pointed out, though her tone lacked its earlier sharp skepticism. 3 people and a couple of buildings is exactly how every village in the elemental nation started, Renji countered, a note of genuine pride creeping into his weathered voice. Konoha wasn't always a sprawling shinobi capital. Every great village started with somebody deciding a patch of ground was worth building on. Naruto, listening to this exchange while methodically working through the evening's planning notes by firelight, felt something in his chest tighten with a mixture of satisfaction and mounting urgency. The physical progress was real, tangible, exactly on track with his careful projections. But every week that passed also represented another week of accumulated risk, another week of increasingly strained cover stories, another week of Kakashi's watchful single eye tracking his behavior with what Naruto's careful assessment continued to flag as elevated suspicion. Population currently 3, he noted in his ongoing mental ledger. Construction on schedule. Agricultural yield projections positive but not yet self-sustaining. Estimated timeline to genuine settlement viability, 4 to 6 months, assuming no significant disruption to current resource allocation. He glanced up from his notes, studying the small fire, the 2 people who'd become, in the span of a few short weeks, something considerably more significant to him than simple tactical assets in a carefully engineered plan. Assuming, he added silently, no significant disruption. That assumption, unfortunately, was about to prove considerably less reliable than Naruto's careful calculations had projected. Some distance away, in the same nondescript route facility where Danzō had first ordered a scout dispatched to investigate the mysterious coastal chakra fluctuations, that same masked operative now knelt once again before his superior, delivering a considerably more detailed report than his initial cursory observation weeks earlier. The chakra signature originates from active construction, the operative reported, voice carefully neutral. I have observed structures under active development in the ruins of Uzushiogakure, modest in scale, but employing what appears to be genuine Uzumaki-style reinforcement ceiling. 3 individuals are consistently present at the site, an elderly man, matching records of a documented Uzushiogakure survivor named Rinji, a young girl, approximately 13 years of age, unidentified but bearing visible Uzumaki clan markings, and, the operative paused, and Danzō's single visible eye sharpened with immediate, undivided attention. And, the 3rd individual's identity requires further confirmation, Danzō-sama. However, preliminary observation suggests a strong resemblance to genin records currently on file for one Naruto Uzumaki. The silence that followed stretched long enough that the kneeling operative began to wonder if he'd overstepped some unspoken boundary in his report. But when Danzō finally spoke, his voice carried none of the sharp displeasure the operative had half expected, instead settling into something considerably more calculating. Interesting, Danzō said slowly, steepling his fingers before him, his single eye narrowing with the particular intensity of a man reassessing an entire strategic calculation in real time. The Kyubi's container, quietly rebuilding his mother's destroyed homeland, without a single word to the village that houses him. He fell silent for a long moment, considering the implications with the same patient, calculating thoroughness he applied to every piece on his considerable political chessboard. Tell me, has the boy displayed any capability inconsistent with his official academy records? The construction work observed would require considerably more advanced chakra control and reserve capacity than his academy file indicates, Danzō-sama. The pace and scale of the observed development suggests either significant recent growth in ability, or the boy has been concealing his true capability for some time, Danzō finished, something that might have been the faintest ghost of satisfaction touching his otherwise impassive expression. A Jinchuriki with genuine strategic capacity, quietly building an independent power base outside the village's direct oversight. This changes considerably more than a simple territorial anomaly. He rose slowly from his seated position, moving toward the room's single narrow window, gazing out at the darkened village beyond with an expression that revealed nothing of the calculations now unfolding behind his weathered features. Continue monitoring, he said finally, without turning back to address his kneeling subordinate. I want to understand the full scope of what the boy is building before we determine our next move. A resource this valuable should not be disrupted carelessly, but neither should it be allowed to grow entirely beyond our reach. Naruto, of course, remained entirely unaware of this exchange, his attention fully consumed by the increasingly demanding logistics of balancing his Team 7 obligations against his ongoing reconstruction efforts, a balancing act that grew more precarious with each passing week, as Kakashi's careful, watchful observation showed no signs of the diminishing suspicion Naruto had originally hoped time and consistent behavior might eventually produce. If anything, the opposite seemed increasingly true. "You've gotten faster," Kakashi observed one morning, during a routine sparring exercise intended to assess the team's individual taijutsu progress. He just watched Naruto narrowly avoid a strike that, by any reasonable assessment of his supposedly mediocre academy record, should have connected solidly. Noticeably faster than even a few weeks ago. "Guess all that solo training's finally paying off," Naruto said, injecting careful enthusiasm into his voice while internally recalculating the acceptable margin of visible improvement he could safely display, without further compounding Kakashi's growing suspicion. Kakashi said, in that same unreadable tone that had unsettled Naruto since the very first day of the bell test. "Must be some pretty intense solo training." Sasuke, watching this exchange from the sidelines with his usual guarded intensity, said nothing, but Naruto caught the flicker of calculating assessment in the Uchiha's dark eyes, the same quiet cataloging of inconsistencies that Naruto himself had noticed building over the past several weeks. Risk accumulation exceeding original projections, Naruto noted grimly, later that evening, reviewing his careful ledger of observed suspicious moments and near-miss explanations. Kakashi-sensei, elevated and sustained suspicion, currently unconfirmed but actively monitored. Sasuke, independently arrived at suspicion of behavioral inconsistency, currently passive observation only. Sakura, aware something is unusual, currently deferring to teammates' more active investigation. He set down his pencil, staring at the accumulated list of warning signs with the same clinical detachment he applied to any strategic assessment, even as a very human undercurrent of genuine worry threaded through his careful calculations. Timeline to potential exposure, uncertain, but likely measured in weeks rather than months at current trajectory. Recommend accelerating Uzushiogakures development towards self-sufficient viability, in case circumstances require an earlier-than-planned transition away from covert operation. It was, Naruto reflected, a genuinely uncomfortable conclusion to reach, the recognition that his carefully constructed double life, built with such meticulous attention to detail over so many months, might nonetheless be approaching an expiration date considerably sooner than he'd originally hoped. But there was, he reminded himself, drawing what comfort he could from the tangible, physical progress represented by 2 completed structures and a growing agricultural terrace on a stretch of coastline that had, just months earlier, been nothing but ruins and forgotten grief. No version of this plan that had ever promised to be easy. He simply needed to move faster than the mounting suspicion closing in around him. The opportunity to accelerate came, unexpectedly, from a source Naruto hadn't fully anticipated. A routine D-rank mission assignment that placed Team 7 on an extended, multi-day escort duty accompanying a minor merchant caravan traveling along Fire Country's eastern trade routes. It was, on the surface, precisely the kind of tedious, unremarkable assignment Naruto had grown accustomed to over the past several months. But buried within the mission briefing, Naruto's careful attention caught a detail that sparked immediate, methodical calculation. The trade route in question passed within a single day's travel of the coastal region housing Uzushiogakures ruins. Opportunity, he noted, reviewing the mission parameters with newfound interest. 3-day round trip, minimal direct supervision during the caravan's overnight stops. If I can arrange even a few hours of unsupervised time during one of the rest stops, I could check on construction progress without requiring a separate, fully unaccounted absence from the village. The mission itself proceeded largely without incident, Team 7 successfully escorting the merchant caravan through a stretch of forest occasionally troubled by minor bandit activity, though nothing that seriously tested their still developing combat coordination. Naruto, careful as always to maintain his established persona, contributed exactly the right mixture of overeager enthusiasm and tactical missteps to avoid drawing further scrutiny, while privately using every spare moment to refine his plans for the brief, unsupervised window he anticipated during their final overnight stop. That window came on the mission's second evening, as the caravan made camp within a few hours' travel of the coastline, and Kakashi, satisfied with the day's uneventful progress, granted the team a rare evening of unstructured downtime before their final push toward the mission's completion the following day. Naruto waited until Sakura had settled into her sleeping role and Sasuke had withdrawn to his customary solitary perch at the edge of the camp before quietly slipping away into the surrounding darkness, chakra carefully suppressed, moving with the same practiced stealth he'd refined over months of similar covert excursions. He didn't notice, in his careful focus on avoiding detection from his own teammates, the single dark eye that briefly opened beneath a lazily angled forehead protector, tracking his departure with quiet, calculating attention before settling closed once more. The brief visit to Uzushiogakure that followed was, by necessity, considerably shorter than Naruto's usual full-day expeditions, a few precious hours spent reviewing construction progress with Renji and Kid, by lamplight, adjusting timelines, and addressing a handful of practical concerns that had accumulated since his last visit. Eastern Terrace yield is ahead of projections, Kid reported, walking him through the modest but genuinely encouraging agricultural progress. We'll have our first proper harvest within the month, if the weather holds. And the second shelter's roof should be finished by your next visit, Renji added, gesturing toward the partially completed structure silhouetted against the moonlit ruins. Assuming you can actually manage another visit soon. You're looking thinner than last time, kid. All this sneaking around wearing on you? I'm managing, Naruto said, which was, if anything, a generous characterization of his current state of near constant vigilance and mounting exhaustion. Just need a little more time. Things are getting complicated back in the village. Kid studied him with the same sharp, perceptive attention she directed at every aspect of the construction plans over the past several weeks. Your team's getting suspicious, she said, not quite a question. They're getting suspicious, Naruto confirmed. Nothing confirmed yet. But it's accumulating faster than I'd like. Then maybe it's time to think about what happens when they figure it out, Renji said, settling onto a low stone bench with the weary patience of a man who'd survived considerably worse crises than one boy's precarious double life. Because from where I'm standing, kid, you can't keep this hidden forever. Sooner or later, somebody's gonna see the whole picture. Naruto said nothing for a long moment, staring out at the dark silhouette of the settlement they built together, modest, incomplete, but genuinely, tangibly real in a way that no amount of careful planning back in his Konoha apartment could ever have fully anticipated. I know, he said finally quietly. I'm working on it. But even as he said it, some careful, methodical corner of his mind was already running through the accumulated variables of his situation. Kakashi's mounting suspicion, Sasuke's independent observations, Danzō's unknown but historically dangerous interest in anything resembling an unmonitored asset, and arriving, with growing unease, at a conclusion he hadn't yet been ready to fully confront. The mask, carefully maintained for 4 long years, was beginning to fail. And somewhere out in the darkness beyond the ruins he'd worked so hard to rebuild, forces he hadn't yet fully accounted for were already beginning to move. Team 7 returned from the caravan escort mission without incident. The merchants delivered safely to their destination, the modest bandit skirmish from the trip's first day already fading into the unremarkable category of successful, forgettable D-rank work that filled the bulk of a genin team's early career. Naruto had expected, based on his careful calculations, that the mission's conclusion would mark a return to the familiar rhythm of village life, training in the mornings, tedious chores in the afternoons, and the increasingly precious, increasingly monitored rest days he'd been using to sustain his work on the coast. What he hadn't fully anticipated was the specific shape the following week's training would take, or how directly it would force the very confrontation he'd spent months carefully engineering his entire life to avoid. Today, Kakashi announced, standing before his 3 genin at Training Ground 7 with a scroll tucked beneath one arm and an expression that carried, even by his usual inscrutable standards, an unusual degree of deliberate weight. We're doing something a little different. Sakura shifted, glancing between her teammates with visible curiosity. Sasuke said nothing, though Naruto, cataloging every micro-expression with the same obsessive thoroughness he applied to any potentially significant variable, noted a faint tightening around the Uchiha's eyes that suggested he, too, sensed something unusual in their sensei's tone. Individual tactical assessments, Kakashi continued, unfurling the scroll to reveal what appeared to be a detailed diagram of the training ground, marked with a complex series of numbered positions and shaded zones. Each of you will face a set of controlled combat scenarios, one at a time, while the other 2 observe. I want to see how each of you thinks under pressure, not just how hard you can hit something. A structured evaluation, Naruto assessed immediately, his mind already racing through the implications. Direct, individual assessment, with observers present. This significantly reduces the room for the kind of engineered team dynamic manipulation I used during the Bell test. Recalculate risk profile. Sakura, you're first, Kakashi said, and the exercise began. Sakura's assessment proceeded largely as Naruto's careful projections had anticipated. A series of escalating scenarios testing her chakra control, her analytical response to sudden tactical shifts, and her capacity to maintain composure under mounting pressure. She performed competently, if unremarkably, her considerable book knowledge translating into solid theoretical responses that occasionally outpaced her physical execution, precisely the profile Naruto had already catalogued for her weeks earlier. Sasuke's turn followed, and here Naruto watched with somewhat closer attention, cataloging the Uchiha's genuinely impressive tactical instincts that, Naruto privately noted, weren't quite as far behind his own careful calculations as Sasuke's classmates likely assumed, though still operating at a level considerably below what Naruto's own capabilities represented. Then it was Naruto's turn. Same setup as the others, Kakashi said, gesturing toward the marked training ground. I want to see your decision-making, not just your taijutsu. Consider it a chance to demonstrate whatever it is you've actually been working on during all that solo training. The words landed with a weight that Naruto's careful analytical mind immediately flagged as deliberate, not an offhand comment, but a pointed, calculated invitation. The kind a sufficiently perceptive sensei might construct specifically to force a student into revealing more than they intended. He's engineering this, Naruto realized, his pulse quickening despite his outward calm. This entire exercise may have been designed around observing me specifically, with Sakura and Sasuke's assessments serving as cover for the actual objective. He had, in that moment, perhaps 3 seconds to make a decision that would have profound implications for every careful calculation he'd made over the preceding months. Perform at his usual, deliberately limited level, and risk Kakashi's suspicion hardening from unconfirmed theory into active investigation, or reveal more of his actual capability, and risk exposing precisely the kind of anomalous strength that would raise even more immediate and pointed questions. Neither option is acceptable at full extremes, Naruto calculated rapidly. Middle path required. Demonstrate improvement consistent with plausible intense solo training, while maintaining enough visible imperfection to avoid triggering full alarm. The first scenario deployed a series of simple training dummies, rigged with basic trap mechanisms designed to test reaction speed and improvisational combat thinking. Naruto moved through it with careful, deliberate calibration, fast enough to demonstrate genuine improvement, but not so fast as to suggest capability far beyond a boy who'd supposedly failed the graduation exam 3 times. The second scenario increased in complexity, introducing multiple simultaneous threats requiring genuine tactical prioritization. Naruto navigated it with the same careful restraint, allowing himself one deliberately imperfect decision, a moment's hesitation that cost him a theoretical hit from one of the training constructs, specifically to maintain the illusion of a boy still very much learning rather than one who'd already mastered the underlying principles months ago. But the third scenario, Naruto realized almost too late, had been constructed differently from the first two. This one's a puzzle, not just a fight, Kakashi said, as the training ground's final configuration revealed itself, a complex arrangement of sealed barriers, requiring not brute force but careful analysis of chakra flow patterns to identify the correct sequence of activation points. Naruto felt something in his chest tighten with genuine alarm. This wasn't a simple test of reaction speed or basic tactical thinking. This was, unmistakably, a Fuinjutsu comprehension exercise, the kind of puzzle specifically designed to reveal whether a student possessed genuine ceiling theory knowledge, or merely the surface-level academy fundamentals every genin was expected to have. This is deliberate, Naruto thought, his analytical mind racing through every possible interpretation of this specific test's construction. Kakashi suspects Fuinjutsu knowledge specifically. This isn't a general capability assessment, this is a targeted probe. He had, in that critical moment, an excruciatingly narrow window to decide precisely how much of his considerable ceiling knowledge drawn directly from generations of recovered Uzumaki scrolls, knowledge that no academy student should possess in any form, he could safely demonstrate without providing Kakashi with irrefutable confirmation of exactly what he'd been suspecting for weeks. He chose, in the end, a calculated partial failure, correctly identifying 2 of the 3 required activation sequences through what he carefully framed as lucky guessing combined with basic pattern recognition, while deliberately fumbling the 3rd in a manner consistent with a student who'd absorbed some fragmentary knowledge without full mastery. It was, he recognized even as he executed it, a thin, imperfect performance. And judging by the single visible eye now studying him with an expression that had shifted from mere suspicion into something considerably more focused, Kakashi hadn't fully bought it. Interesting, Kakashi said, once the exercise concluded, his tone carrying a weight that made Naruto's pulse quicken despite every ounce of careful control he exercised over his outward expression. You identified 2 out of 3 activation sequences on a chakra flow puzzle most Chūnin would need considerable time to work through. But you're telling me that's guesswork. Guess I got lucky again, Naruto said, forcing the same easy, oblivious grin he'd deployed after the bell test weeks earlier. Kakashi's single eye remained fixed on him for a long, uncomfortable moment, and Naruto felt the full weight of that scrutiny settle over him like a physical pressure. You know, Naruto, I've been a shinobi for a long time. I've seen a lot of things that look like luck turn out to be something considerably more deliberate. Sakura and Sasuke, standing at the edge of the training ground, exchanged a glance that Naruto's peripheral attention caught and immediately catalogued, Sasuke's expression carrying the same calculating suspicion he displayed weeks earlier, Sakura showing genuine, uncomplicated confusion at the sudden tension in the exchange. I'm not accusing you of anything, Kakashi continued, and Naruto noted, with a mixture of relief and continued wariness, that his sensei's tone had shifted from pointed interrogation towards something more measured, almost contemplative. But I want you to understand something. Whatever you're hiding, and I do think you're hiding something, Naruto, I'd rather you trust your team with it than let it fester into something that puts all of us at risk during an actual mission. The words landed with considerably more force than Naruto had anticipated, striking at a consideration he'd spent months carefully suppressing beneath layers of tactical calculation. The genuine, uncomfortable possibility that his careful secrecy, however necessary for his own survival, might eventually place his teammates in danger through simple lack of information. He's not wrong, Naruto thought, an uncomfortable truth settling into his careful mental ledger alongside every other calculated risk. A team operating with incomplete information about a member's actual capabilities carries genuine tactical vulnerability. This isn't just about my secret. It's about their safety too. But even as this uncomfortable truth registered, Naruto's careful, methodical mind immediately began weighing it against every other variable in play. Danzō's unconfirmed but historically dangerous interest, the village council's documented pattern of fear-driven overreaction toward anything resembling Jinchuriki capability, the very real possibility that full disclosure, however well-intentioned, might result in consequences considerably worse than his teammates' continued mild suspicion. I'll think about it, Naruto said finally, which was, in its own careful way, the most honest thing he'd said to Kakashi in weeks. That evening, back in his apartment, Naruto sat before his notebook with a considerably heavier weight settling over his usual methodical calculations than he'd experienced in some time. Kakashi's suspicion has crossed the critical threshold, he wrote, working through the implications with careful, deliberate thoroughness. No longer passive observation, active, targeted testing now confirmed. Recommend treating full exposure as a near-term probability rather than a distant contingency. He paused, staring at that line for a long moment, before adding, with the same careful precision he applied to any strategic assessment, consider, is continued full secrecy still the optimal strategy, or has the calculus shifted toward controlled, partial disclosure? It was a question he'd avoided seriously engaging with for months, precisely because every instinct honed by 4 years of careful self-preservation screamed against it. But Kakashi's pointed comment, "I'd rather you trust your team with it," had introduced a variable Naruto's careful calculations hadn't fully weighted, the genuine value of allies who knew the truth, versus the compounding risk of allies who merely suspected it. Full disclosure to Team 7, risk of information reaching the village council or Danzō through unintended channels. Considerable danger given documented historical pattern of fear-driven response to Jinchuriki capability. Partial disclosure, reveal enhanced capability without revealing Uzushiogakure project specifically. Reduces immediate suspicion regarding combat ability while preserving the settlement's secrecy. Continued full secrecy. Sustainable only if I can further refine performance calibration. Current trajectory suggests diminishing returns. Kakashi's suspicion index has increased despite careful management. He sat with these calculations for a long time, the lamp burning low, before finally settling on a modified approach. He would allow Kakashi to believe he'd been engaging in genuinely intensive, if unconventional, solo training, without specifying its location or true scope, while continuing to withhold any mention of Uzushiogakure itself. It wasn't a complete solution, but it represented, he calculated, the optimal balance between the competing risks currently in tension. Tomorrow, he wrote, closing his notebook with a decisiveness that belied the considerable unease still churning beneath his careful analytical surface, I initiate controlled partial disclosure. The opportunity came the following morning, before the day's official training began, when Naruto found Kakashi alone at Training Ground 7, arriving earlier than his usual habitually tardy schedule to review the previous day's evaluation notes. Sensei, Naruto said, approaching with a deliberate lack of his usual exaggerated energy, a calculated shift meant to signal, without words, that what followed carried genuine weight. Can I talk to you about something? Actually talk, not the usual stuff. Kakashi's single visible eye studied him for a long moment, something in his posture shifting subtly toward genuine attention. I'm listening. Naruto took a slow breath, working through the careful framing he'd rehearsed the night before. You're right that I've been hiding something, he said. I have been training, really training, way more seriously than I let on. I've got reasons for keeping it quiet that aren't really about not trusting you or the team. It's more complicated than that. Complicated how? There's stuff about my situation, the seal, my family, things the village doesn't really talk about openly, that make it dangerous for certain people to know exactly what I'm capable of, Naruto continued, carefully constructing his explanation to remain technically truthful while omitting the specific, critical details about Uzushiogakure that he had no intention of revealing. I'm not trying to shut you out, I've had to be really careful about who knows what, for a long time now. Kakashi studied him for a long, considering moment, and Naruto found himself genuinely uncertain, for the first time in longer than he could recall, exactly how this particular calculation would resolve. The seal, Kakashi said finally, his tone carefully neutral in a way that told Naruto his sensei understood considerably more about that particular subject than official record likely reflected. I know more about that than you probably think I do, Naruto. And I understand better than most why certain people in this village might present a genuine danger if they learned you were developing capability beyond what they've already decided to be afraid of. Something in Naruto's chest loosened, fractionally, at this unexpected acknowledgement. So you're not going to push? I didn't say that, Kakashi said, and something almost like a smile crinkled the visible corner of his eye. I said I understand your caution. That doesn't mean I'm going to stop paying attention, but I can work with careful, Naruto. What I can't work with is a teammate who's hiding something so significant that it puts the rest of us at risk without warning. That's fair, Naruto said, and meant it. Good, Kakashi said, straightening and glancing toward the training ground entrance, where Sakura and Sasuke had just come into view, approaching for the day's scheduled training. Then let's leave it there for now. But Naruto, he paused, his single eye holding Naruto's gaze with unusual gravity. Whatever you're carrying, whatever you're protecting, if it ever becomes something this team needs to know to keep each other safe, I expect you to tell us. Deal? Deal, Naruto said, and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, the smallest fraction of his carefully maintained burden ease, even if only slightly. The controlled disclosure, imperfect and incomplete as it was, produced results considerably more favorable than Naruto's cautious calculations had projected. Kakashi's overt testing exercises diminished in frequency over the following days, replaced by something that felt, to Naruto's careful observation, more like genuine mentorship than suspicious surveillance. Targeted training suggestions that acknowledged, implicitly, greater capability than his academy record suggested, without demanding Naruto account for its full origin. Sasuke, for his part, remained more openly skeptical, his dark eyes tracking Naruto's continued absences and occasional slips in careful performance with the same calculating intensity he'd displayed for weeks. But even his suspicions seemed to settle, gradually, into something more like grudging acceptance. The recognition, Naruto suspected, that whatever Naruto was hiding, it hadn't yet manifested as any kind of threat to the team's cohesion or safety. "You're still not telling us everything," Sasuke said one afternoon, catching Naruto alone during a brief lull in their D-rank chores, his tone carrying more observation than accusation. "No," Naruto agreed simply, deciding that at least partial honesty represented the safer path forward. "There's stuff I can't talk about yet. Maybe not ever. But it's not anything that's going to hurt this team, if that's what you're worried about." Sasuke studied him for a long moment, something unreadable flickering behind his dark eyes. "Fine," he said finally, in a tone that suggested the matter was, for now, settled, though Naruto suspected it was a settlement built on cautious patience rather than genuine resolution. "Just don't make me regret trusting you on that." It was, Naruto reflected as Sasuke walked away, about as much reassurance as he could realistically hope to extract from the notoriously guarded Uchiha, and considerably more than he'd anticipated receiving, just days earlier. With the immediate pressure from Kakashi's investigation somewhat eased, Naruto returned his full attention to Uzushiogakures' continued development, his next available rest day finding him back on the familiar coastal path with a renewed sense of urgency tempered by the small, hard-won relief of a crisis, at least temporarily, averted. The settlement, he found upon arrival, had grown in ways considerably more significant than the physical construction he'd been tracking through his careful weekly reports from Renji and Keed. "We've got more people," Keed announced, meeting him at the edge of the eastern terraces with an expression that mixed genuine excitement with her usual careful pragmatism. "Word's been spreading, quiet-like, through some of the old fishing communities up the coast. Turns out we're not the only Uzushio survivors who never really found anywhere else to belong." Naruto felt his pulse quicken with a mixture of excitement and immediate, careful calculation. "How many?" "4 more, so far," Renji said, joining them with a satisfied expression that Naruto hadn't seen on the old man's weathered features before. "A family of 3, mother, father, and a boy about your age, who'd been scraping by in a coastal village a few days south. And an older woman, lost most of her family in the original attack same as the rest of us. Been living alone even longer than I have." Naruto's mind immediately began recalculating every aspect of his careful population projections, cross-referencing this unexpected growth against his agricultural capacity, his construction timeline, and with mounting concern, the increased risk profile that came with a rapidly expanding settlement. "Population now 8, pending my confirmation of the new arrivals," he noted internally. "This exceeds original growth projections by a significant margin, requires immediate reassessment of resource allocation and, more critically, operational security. I need to meet them," Naruto said aloud, already moving toward the settlement's central structures. "And we need to talk about how we're managing this. More people means more visibility, more potential points of failure in keeping this place hidden." "Already thought of that," Keed said, falling into step beside him with the confident stride of someone who'd spent the past weeks growing steadily more invested in the settlement's success. "Told them all the same thing you told me. This only works if everyone understands the need for quiet. No trips to nearby villages announcing what we're building. No contact with anyone outside unless it's carefully planned." Naruto felt a genuine flicker of something like pride at this unprompted display of exactly the operational discipline his careful calculations had always assumed would be difficult to establish. "You've been running this like an actual settlement," he said. "Not just waiting for me to show up with instructions. Someone's got to keep things moving when you're stuck playing Genin in Konoha," Keed said, with a small, genuine smile that had become considerably more frequent over the past several weeks than her initial guarded hostility would ever have suggested possible. The new arrivals proved, upon introduction, to be exactly the kind of cautious, quietly hopeful additions Naruto had hoped his growing settlement might attract. The family of 3, a weathered fisherman named Toma, his wife Emi, and their son Haru, a boy perhaps a year younger than Naruto himself, had spent years scraping together a marginal existence in a coastal village considerably poorer than even Uzushiogakures' current ruined state, and their gratitude at the prospect of genuine, communal rebuilding carried a weight that made Naruto's careful, analytical assessment of the situation considerably harder to maintain with full detachment. "We don't have much to offer," Toma said, standing before Naruto with the careful humility of a man who'd spent too many years being disappointed by circumstance to fully trust good fortune when it appeared. "But we can work. Whatever needs doing, we'll do it." "Everyone here works," Naruto said, extending a hand in the formal, deliberate gesture he'd observed Renji use during his own initial recruitment weeks earlier. "And everyone here belongs, if they're willing to put in that work. This isn't charity. It's building something together." The older woman, introduced simply as Hana, proved to be a genuine asset beyond her willing hands, a former healer, it emerged during careful conversation, who'd trained under Uzushiogakures own medical practitioners before the village's destruction, and whose fragmentary but genuine knowledge of the settlement's original medical sealing techniques complemented the recovered vault scrolls in ways Naruto's own theoretical study alone could never have replicated. "There's formulas in those old medical scrolls I haven't seen since I was younger than that boy there," Hana said, examining the recovered documents Naruto had brought on his most recent visit with an expression of genuine, moved recognition. "Thought I'd never see this knowledge again. Thought it died with everyone who used to practice it." "It didn't die," Naruto said quietly. "It just waited." By the end of that day's visit, the settlement's population had grown from 3 to 8. Its skill base expanded considerably by Hana's medical knowledge and Toma's fishing expertise, and Naruto found himself walking the familiar coastal path back toward Konoha as evening settled over the ruins, calculating an entirely new set of projections that accounted for growth considerably faster than his original, cautious timeline had anticipated. "Accelerated growth presents both opportunity and risk," he noted in his mental ledger, even as something considerably warmer than pure calculation settled alongside the careful analysis. "Recommend formalizing basic governance structure sooner than originally planned, to ensure sustainable community cohesion as population continues expanding." He allowed himself, for just a moment, to imagine what this place might look like in a year. 2 years. A genuine village, rebuilt from ruins and grief, populated by people who'd spent years believing they had nowhere left to belong. He did not notice, on that particular evening walk back toward the village, the second route operative now stationed at a considerably closer observation point than his predecessor weeks earlier, close enough, this time, to catalog not merely the settlement's growing physical infrastructure, but the specific identities and numbers of its expanding population, information that would, within hours, find its way onto Danzō's desk in a report considerably more detailed and alarming than any that had preceded it. Nor did he notice, arriving back in Konoha late that evening, the single messenger hawk already circling toward a specific, unmarked section of the village, a summons, quietly dispatched, that would find its way to him the following morning in the form of an unremarkable note slipped beneath his apartment door, requesting his presence at an address Naruto's careful research had, months earlier, already identified as belonging to one of Danzō Shimura's numerous unofficial meeting locations. He found the note the next morning, reading its carefully neutral, unsigned instructions with a rapidly cooling sense of dread that no amount of methodical calculation could entirely suppress. "Present yourself at the address below, alone, before midday. Failure to comply will be noted with considerable interest." Naruto stood in his small apartment for a long moment, the note trembling almost imperceptibly in his hand, running through every possible calculation, every conceivable contingency, and arriving, finally, at the uncomfortable, inescapable conclusion that whatever careful secrecy he maintained for months, whatever elaborate cover stories and cautious calibrations had kept his double life intact through Kakashi's mounting suspicion and Sasuke's careful observation, had apparently proven insufficient against a considerably more dangerous kind of attention entirely. Danzō knew. And Danzō, evidently, wanted to talk.